The October wind came across the Ash River flats with the sound of a blade being sharpened on stone. It was a high, thin sound that scoured the land, peeling the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwoods and chasing herds of tumbleweed like panicked sheep toward the low, bruised horizon. A storm was coming, not the quick, violent anger of a summer squall, but a slow, brooding siege that promised to turn the world to mud and misery. The sky was the color of old iron, and the air smelled of dust and the cold, clean scent of water that had yet to fall. Rowan Beckett's ranch, the half-lantern, hunkered low against the prairie, its unpainted plank walls silvered by years of sun and wind. It was a place built for endurance, not comfort, a collection of straight lines and hard angles braced against the endless curve of the earth. From the barn, Rowan watched the wind's assault. At 38, he was a man carved from the same hard material as his ranch spare, broad-shouldered, with a stillness about him that could be mistaken for peace but was, in fact, a carefully managed absence of it. He finished his count, his hand resting on the rough twine of the last hay bale. 112, enough to see his meager stock through a hard winter. He counted them every evening, a pointless ritual, a penance paid in numbers. It was a way to fill a space, to push a thought down for a few more hours. The barn was full of the scent of dry alfalfa and horse, honest smells that asked nothing of him. The house was different. The house hummed with a silence that had a weight and a shape, a silence that had moved in the day they buried Caleb. 2 years. It felt like a lifetime and no time at all. He could still see his younger brother's grin, the flash of it in the sun before the longhorns broke, before the world dissolved into a storm of dust and hooves and panicked bellows. Rowan had been the trail boss. He had made the call to cross the dry culvert. It was his fault. The thought was a smooth, worn stone in his mind, one he turned over and over until its edges no longer cut, but only pressed with a dull, familiar ache. He left the barn, leaning into the wind, his hat pulled low. The door to the small ranch house protested on its leather hinges. Inside, the silence rushed to meet him. It filled the single main room, pooling in the corners, clinging to the cold iron of the stove. The room was ruthlessly clean, stripped of anything that wasn't essential. A pine table and 2 chairs, a dry sink, a stone hearth, and a narrow cot in the corner that served as his bed. The only object that held any softness, any color, was the lantern sitting in the exact center of the table. Its base was brass, but its globe was a deep forest green, the kind of glass that turned light into something liquid and mysterious. It had been his mother's, and her mother's before that. Martha Beckett had cherished it, before she'd passed. She'd given it to Rowan, not Caleb. "The oldest son lights the lamp for the family," she'd said, after she was gone, and after Caleb was gone. The words had curdled into a bitter irony. He was the oldest, and he was all that was left. Lighting the lamp was his second ritual of the evening. It was an act of defiance against the coming night, a small rebellion against the darkness that lived both inside the house and inside of him. His movements were practiced, reverent. He lifted the delicate glass chimney, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He trimmed the wick with a small pair of scissors, the snip of the blades unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He struck a match against the hearthstone, the flare of sulfur and phosphorus a brief, angry sun. He touched the flame to the wick. It caught, a tiny orange seed that blossomed slowly, pushing back the gray gloom. He settled the green chimney back in place, and the room was transformed. The flame filtered through the colored glass, threw a soft, honeyed oval of light onto the table. The light caught the deep scars and knife marks in the pine, turning them into a map of shared meals and long-gone conversations. It was a warm, living light, a light that felt like a memory. For a moment, the crushing silence receded to the edges of the glow. The wind howled, rattling the single window in its frame. The first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the glass, sounding like thrown gravel. Rowan moved to the stove, his boots echoing on the floorboards. Coffee. It was a habit from his years on the trail. Hot, black, and bitter. Something to hold on to when the night was long. He was measuring grounds into the pot when he heard it. It wasn't a sound, at first, so much as a vibration through the soles of his boots. A faint, frantic drumming, almost completely swallowed by the rising shriek of the gale. He froze, listening. There it was again. A knock, faint, desperate, but unmistakable. No one came to the half-lantern. Not anymore. Neighbors kept their distance, offering condolences from afar. Their pity a wall he couldn't scale. Drifters and riders on the run knew to bypass this lonely spit of land. There was nothing here for them. Rowan moved to the door, his hand resting for a second on the butt of the Colt that hung in its holster on a peg by the frame. His years as a trail boss had honed his instincts to a fine edge. He knew the difference between trouble and desperation in the dark. He could smell it. He slid the heavy wooden bolt and pulled the door inward. The storm lunged into the house. A blast of wind and rain tore through the room, making the lantern flame gutter wildly. And framed in the doorway, against the tumultuous dark, was a woman. She was drenched to the bone, her clothes plastered to her thin frame. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, streaming water down her face and neck. She stood there, swaying slightly, clutching a heavy oilskin satchel to her chest as if it were a life raft. She was travel-stained, mud-caked, and utterly exhausted, but her eyes, when they met his, were not broken. They were wide and dark, and in their depths, a fierce, determined light burned brightly. Rowan's trail boss instincts took over, a rapid, silent calculation. He sorted victim from predator in the space of a breath. He saw the practical cotton riding skirt, its hem ripped and frayed. He saw her bare feet, blue with cold, bruised and muddy. The boots were gone, likely lost in the swollen ford of the Ash River. He saw her hands, scraped raw and bleeding, the hands of someone who had been climbing over sharp shale in the dark. This was not trouble. This was a soul at the end of her rope. He didn't speak. Questions were a luxury for a warm, dry room. He simply stepped back, holding the door wider, a clear, unspoken invitation. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze sweeping the spare room, landing on him. He saw her assess him just as he had assessed her. Then, with a shudder that seemed to rack her entire body, she stumbled over the threshold. He shut the door, and the roar of the storm was muffled, reduced to a dull, angry roar. The sudden quiet was as profound as the noise had been. The only sounds were the hiss of the lamp, the drumming of rain on the roof, and the soft, wet squelch of her bare feet on his floorboards. He moved without a word, his actions economical. He threw another log into the stove, and the firebox doors yawned open with a groan. Flames leaped up, casting a dancing, red light on the hearth. He took the coffee pot and added more water, setting it on the hot surface to boil. He did not look at her directly, giving her space, allowing her to gather herself. She finally spoke, her voice a raw, hoarse whisper. "I can pay." She had to clear her throat to get the words out. "In chores, laundry, mending. I'm a hard worker. Just let me get warm." The words were plain, but the voice that spoke them was not. Beneath the exhaustion and the rasp, her vowels were shaped with a precision that didn't belong to this hard country. It was the ghost of a New Orleans finishing school, softened and weathered by years out west. A strange and compelling mixture of refinement and grit. She moved to the table and carefully placed the oilskin satchel down, but she did not release it. One hand remained flat on its surface, a possessive, protective gesture. Rowan saw it, filed it away, and pretended not to notice. He took a tin cup from a hook and set it on the table near her, then retrieved a thick wool blanket from a chest at the foot of his cot. A low growl of thunder drubbed the sky, so close it vibrated through the floor. She flinched, another violent shiver passing through her. He held out the blanket. She looked from it to his face. He kept his expression neutral, his gaze steady. After a moment, she took it, her cold fingers brushing his. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, huddling into its rough warmth. "There are dry socks in that crate," he said, his own voice sounding rusty from disuse. He gestured with his chin toward a small wooden box by the hearth. "And a room through that door. It's small, but it's dry. You're safe here." The words hung in the air between them. "You're safe here." A promise he hadn't made to anyone in a long time. She didn't move immediately. She stood by the table, clutching her satchel, the wool blanket a dark cocoon around her. She was studying his face, her dark eyes searching, probing. He knew what she was looking for: cruelty, opportunity, the predatory gleam of a man who understood her vulnerability and saw a chance to exploit it. He had seen that look in other men often enough to recognize it. He met her gaze without flinching, letting her see what was there. He knew it wasn't much, just a deep, abiding weariness, the steady blue fatigue of a man who had lost too much, and now wanted only to be left alone. Slowly, she seemed to find what she was looking for, or perhaps what she was not looking for. The tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction. The fierce, defensive light in her eyes softened into something that was just tired. The house seemed to breathe with her, a collective, quiet exhalation of relief. The lamp flame, which had been dancing in the drafts, climbed steadily now, a straight, unwavering spear of green-gold light. Without another word, she picked up her satchel and walked toward the door he had indicated. It led to a small, windowless room, little more than a storage space, that held a simple rope bed and a clean mattress ticking stuffed with straw. It had been Caleb's room. Rowan hadn't been inside it in 2 years. She paused in the doorway, her back to him. For a moment, he thought she would just disappear inside, and the encounter would be over, at least for the night, but then she turned, her silhouette framed against the darkness of the small room. A tired, crooked smile touched her lips, a fragile thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're not sleeping alone anymore," she said, her voice still hoarse but carrying a strange, new resonance in the quiet house. Rowan froze, his hand halfway to his coffee cup. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. It was a simple statement of fact, yet it landed in the center of his solitude like a lit stick of dynamite. It was a joke, a threat, a promise, all at once. It was the truest thing anyone had said to him in 2 years. She held his gaze for one long, unreadable moment, then turned and stepped into the darkness of the other room. Pulling the door quietly shut behind her, Rowan stood motionless in the center of the room. The wind moaned around the eaves of the house. The rain beat a steady rhythm on the roof. But inside, the silence that rushed back in to fill the space was different now. It was no longer empty. It was charged, alert, waiting. He looked at the closed door, then at the empty space on the floor where she had stood dripping moments before. The honeyed light of the green glass lantern fell on the scarred table, on the waiting tin cup, on the heavy, mysterious satchel she had left behind. The lamp hissed softly, a sound like a drawn breath. And for the first time in a very long time, Rowan Beckett felt the presence of another heartbeat under his roof. He was not alone, and he did not know if that was a comfort or a terror. Dawn broke not as a light, but as a dilution of the dark. The blackness of the storm-thrashed night gave way to a cold, flat pewter gray. The wind had died, leaving an exhausted, dripping silence in its wake. The world felt scoured, new, and dangerously quiet. Rowan awoke on his cot. His first sensation the biting cold in the room. His second was a smell. It was not the familiar, stale scent of wood smoke and old coffee. It was the sharp, nutty aroma of cornmeal frying in bacon fat. He sat up, his joints stiff. The door to Caleb's room was open. He'd left it ajar, a gesture of trust he hadn't fully examined. He swung his legs over the side of the cot and pulled on his boots. The simple act sent a familiar, dull ache up his left leg. He stood, testing the ankle. It was stiff, angry from the damp. He moved into the main room and stopped. Mira Solis was at his stove, her back to him, She had found his provisions: the sack of cornmeal, the slab of bacon, the tin of molasses. She moved with a practiced, economical efficiency, her hands quick and sure as she flipped a griddle cake onto a tin plate. She had built up the fire, and the room, while still cold, had lost its tomb-like chill. She had found a spare flannel shirt of his, rolled the sleeves up to her elbows, and tied the waist with a bit of twine. Her own skirt, still damp, was draped over a chair near the hearth. Her dark hair, free of mud, was combed back from her face and tied with what looked like a strip of cloth torn from her own ruined petticoat. She was a different person from the half-drowned creature he had pulled from the storm. The desperation was gone, replaced by a focused, almost fierce competence. She was cooking like a woman laying claim to the day, as if she hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks, surviving on cold beans and hardtack. She turned, holding the plate, and startled slightly at finding him watching her. Her face was pale and smudged with soot, but her eyes were clear. "I found the larder," she said, her voice still rough but firmer than the night before. "I hope you don't mind. I'll work it off." Rowan just shook his head and moved to the stove. Grabbing the coffee pot, he poured the steaming, bitter liquid into 2 tin cups. He set one on the table, then sat, the wood of the chair protesting under his weight. She placed the plate of griddle cakes between them, a small stack that steamed in the gray light. Then she sat opposite him. As she reached for the molasses, her rolled-up sleeve slid back. Rowan saw her wrists clearly for the first time. They were raw, deep, angry red ridges, chafed and swollen, encircled her skin. These were not the accidental burns of a cook or the chafe of a ranch hand. He'd seen rope burns before, plenty of them, but those were from lariats, from handling stock. These were different. These were the marks of bonds meant to hold a person, and hold them tight. His gaze flickered from her wrists to her face. She saw him looking. She didn't pull the sleeve down. She simply met his eyes, a silent, defiant acknowledgement. As he looked away, he shifted in his chair, rubbing his bad ankle. Her gaze dropped. She watched him favor the leg, saw the wince he couldn't entirely hide. She noted the way he put his weight on his right side, the slight, ingrained limp that told a story of old, badly set bone. A quiet, unspoken inventory was taken across the table. They were 2 people stitched together with frontier scars, one pair fresh and raw, the other old and deep. Each recognized the mark of pain in the other. Each understood that survival was a thing that left a permanent trace on the body. They ate in silence. The griddle cakes were light, crisp, and perfect. He hadn't tasted food like this in 2 years. The silence in the room was no longer the humming, empty void of his grief. It was the shared, watchful quiet of 2 strangers with too much to say. When she finished, she pushed her plate back. The food had brought color to her face, a focused energy. "Do you have a map of the territory?" she asked. The question was abrupt. He nodded, rose, and went to a tall, narrow cabinet. From the top shelf, he pulled a rolled tube of oilcloth. He brought it to the table and spread it out. It was a topographical survey map of the Wyoming Territory, crisscrossed with lines for creeks, elevation, and proposed rail spurs. The green glass lamp, still lit from the night before, pooled its warm light on the paper, fighting the weak dawn. Her finger, still grazed and raw from her climb, landed on the map with authority. She traced a long, jagged line of mountains. "Black Juniper Ridge," she murmured, her voice low. "And this." "Gull's Teeth. Bluff." She traced a line from the bluff down to the Ash River. Her brow furrowed. She was measuring distances, not in miles, but in time, in creeks to be forded, in ridges to be climbed. "What are you measuring?" Rowan asked, his voice flat. She looked up. "How long I have, how far they'll be behind me. Who's they?" She didn't answer him directly. Her eyes went to the oilskin satchel, which sat on the floor by her feet, still muddy, still clutched tight. "I need to tell you what I have, because if they find me, they can't find it. And if they get it, you, this ranch, All of this? She waved a hand at the room. It'll all be gone. Rowan leaned back, crossing his arms. Start talking. I was a night nurse in Cheyenne. She began, her voice gaining that strange, educated cadence he'd noted before, at the Territorial Hospital. Before that, I worked a telegraph key in Laramie. I was trained to listen, to pay attention to details, to memorize, and to vanish. She knelt and retrieved the satchel, placing it on the table with a heavy, wet thud. Her hands worked at the stiff buckles. She unrolled the top and pulled out a package wrapped in thick, greased, waxed cloth. She carefully unfolded the cloth, revealing a leather-bound book. It was a freight ledger, thick and well-made, its cover stamped with the insignia of a large shipping concern. You know of Barlow Creed, she asked. Rowan nodded. Creed Company Freight. He's the man bringing the railroad to Shade Bluff. He's a hero. Round here, a man of progress. He's a thief, Mira said, the words sharp and cold. She opened the ledger. The pages were filled not with manifests, but with columns of dense, baffling code, symbols, numbers, and substituted letters. Creed is charismatic, she said, her finger tapping the page. He gives speeches about the future, about connecting the territory, but this book is the truth. It links his shipments of equipment, that's his code for dynamite, hired guns, and bribery to specific dates and locations. She reached back into the satchel and pulled out several loose pages of notes. Her own handwriting this time, sharp and precise. And this is what those dates mean. She laid a note next to a coded entry. Ranch foreclosures. He uses a network of debt traps, run through the land office and the banks. He gets ranchers to over-leverage, then calls in the note when the creek runs dry, and he's the one diverting the creeks. She pointed to another line. Widow auctions. That's what his men call them. When a rancher dies or disappears. The property goes to auction for the debt. Creed's agents are the only bidders. They buy the land for pennies on the dollar. Her voice grew colder. And this? Settlement escorts. That's the most genteel name for it. Once the widows and their families are bought out, they are offered protection and an escort to a settlement in the West. They're moved off the land they just lost. Land Creed needs for the one thing he can sell for a fortune. She looked at Rowan, her eyes burning. Water rights. He's not building a railroad. He's stealing a river. And he's selling the water rights to the railroad for a king's ransom, leaving the whole valley to turn to dust. Rowan stared at the ledger, his mind reeling. It was a conspiracy so vast, so audacious, it was almost unbelievable. How did you get this? He asked, his voice low. A grim smile touched her lips. I told you. I was a nurse. 6 weeks ago. Creed's bookkeeper was brought in. A stabbing in a saloon. He was delirious for 3 days. A fever from the wound. He talked. He muttered the codes. The names. The places. He also kept clutching his vest. She leaned forward. While I was changing his dressings, I felt it. Stitched into the lining. A small, oilcloth packet. Inside were the cipher keys. I copied them, every one, and sewed the packet back in. He never knew. But the ledger? I waited. She said, I knew where he worked. A small freight office near the rail yard. I knew he kept the real ledger in a floor safe. Stealing it was impossible. But a fire changes things. You? A small fire. In the kitchen of the attached eatery. She clarified. Just enough smoke. Just enough panic. During the confusion. I went in through a back window. I knew the safe combination from listening to him in his fever. I pilfered the ledger, put a false one in its place, and was back binding a fireman's hand before the smoke cleared. But someone saw me leaving the office. Someone who wasn't panicking. She closed the book. Creed's enforcers, a man named Haggard Pike, and 2 brothers, Silas and Cole Dern. They've been hunting me ever since. They caught up to me at Dry Step Station. I burned the station to get away. That's where I lost my horse. I've been on foot ever since, cutting across the Badlands. I lost my boots in the ford last night. She stopped, her story told. She watched him, waiting for his reaction, waiting to see if he would throw her out, if he believed her, if he was one of Creed's men. Rowan hadn't moved. His face had gone pale beneath its tan. The coffee cup in his hand was very still. The names echoed in the quiet room, louder than the thunder had been. Haggard Pike, Silas and Cole Dern. He wasn't seeing her. He was seeing a cloud of brown dust 2 years ago. He was hearing the high, terrified bellow of 300 longhorns. He was hearing his own voice screaming his brother's name. Caleb. The official report had called it an accident, a freak stampede, a dynamited culvert from an old mining claim giving way at the worst possible time. But Rowan had been there. He'd seen the men on the ridge, the men who had rerouted the drive, who had assured him the culvert was safe, men in the pay of Creed Company freight, clearing a path for a future spur line. He'd been too blind with grief to see the malice in it, until now. Pike, Dern, the names matched. The men he had argued with that morning, the men who had watched the stampede and then ridden off. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. His jaw set so hard a muscle jumped. The deep, weary fatigue in his blue eyes vanished, burned away by a cold, clarifying rage. The hole in his life, the one that had swallowed his brother, suddenly had a shape and a name. He set the tin cup on the table. The sound was sharp in the silence. He looked at Mira, and she saw the change in him. The man who had rescued her was gone. In his place was someone else, someone harder, someone dangerous. The tension in the room was a wire drawn taut. The thunder was gone. The storm had passed. But the real one was just beginning. Rowan stood. He walked to the hearth, his limp more pronounced. He opened a small wooden box on the mantel, the one his mother had kept her sewing in. He took out a round, flat tin. He walked back to the table, opened it. The sharp, clean scent of pine tar and beeswax filled the air. He looked at her wrists. "Give me your hands," he said. It wasn't a request. She hesitated, then slowly extended her hands, palms down, over the table. He scooped a thick dollop of the black salve onto his fingers and, his touch surprisingly gentle, began to work it into the raw, broken skin of her rope burns. She flinched, the salve stinging, but she did not pull away. His calloused thumb moved over her wounds, methodical, impersonal, and yet deeply, profoundly intimate. He was mending her. When he finished, he wrapped her wrists in clean, narrow strips of cotton cloth. As he tied the last knot, she spoke, her voice quiet. "Your ankle." He stopped. "It's swollen," she said, her nurse's eye taking in the way he held it, the damp. "It's an old break. Isn't it badly set?" He just nodded. "You have to bind it, or you'll be lame by nightfall." She stood, took the remaining strips of cotton, and knelt at his feet. He didn't protest. He lifted his trouser leg, revealing the scarred, thick ankle. Her hands were as professional as his had been. They were firm, quick, and sure, wrapping the joint with a practiced tension that was both supportive and comforting. Her hair fell forward as she worked, and he could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and rain on her. They stayed that way for a moment, the rancher, seated, looking down at the woman kneeling before him, her hands expertly binding his oldest wound as he had just tended hers. The green glass lamp on the table pooled its warm light on them, a silent, solitary witness. She finished, tucked the cloth, and rose, sitting back in her chair. The air between them had shifted again. The rage was still in him, the fear still in her. But they were no longer just two strangers. They were allies, bound by shared pain and a common enemy. Rowan reached for the coffee pot. It was still warm. He refilled both their cups. They sat at arm's length, the map and the ledger between them. Two soldiers in a quiet truce before a war. He held her cup out to her. She reached to take it. As the cup passed from his hand to hers, his fingers brushed the back of her hand. It was the briefest of contacts, the rough heat of his skin against the grazed softness of hers. A spark, small and sudden, that had nothing to do with anger or healing. Neither of them pulled away. For one long suspended beat, their fingers touched, a silent question hanging in the space between them. Then, she took the cup. He drew his hand back. She lifted the cup to her lips, her dark eyes never leaving his over the tin rim. He did the same. The coffee was black, bitter, and hot. It was the taste of the day to come. The coffee in their cups was cold, but neither Rowan nor Mira seemed to notice. The gray morning light had strengthened, filling the small cabin, revealing the grit on the floor and the exhaustion etched around their eyes. The ledger lay open on the table between them, an accusation in leather and ink. The air was still, charged with the weight of Mira's revelations and the violent resurrection of Rowan's grief. "We can't fight him here," Rowan said, his voice flat. He spoke to the map. "Not to her. The half-lantern is too exposed. He'll send Pike, and he won't come to talk." "I'm not running again," Mira said. She was binding her damp hair back, her movements quick and certain. "I've run for 100 miles. I'm done." "This," she tapped the ledger, "is where it stops. It stops with a plan, not with a gunfight we can't win." Rowan stood, his stiff ankle protesting. He went to the cold hearth and picked up a piece of charcoal. From a drawer, he pulled a wide, creased sheet of brown shipping paper. He spread it on the table, next to the official map, and began to draw. His hand, rough and calloused, moved with a surprising fluid certainty. He was not a mapmaker, but he was a man who knew the land. He knew it in his bones, in the ache of his old break, in the memory of the dust. He was sketching the valley, his charcoal lines swift and dark. "This is us, the half-lantern," he said, drawing a small square. "The land is open for 5 miles in every direction, too flat. They'd see us coming, they'd see us going." He drew a winding double line, the Ash River. It cut south here, into Dead Mare Cut. His charcoal paused, the name hanging in the air. "That's where Caleb, that's where the stampede happened. Creed's men funneled them there." Mira watched, her eyes tracking from his hand to the ledger. She turned a page, her finger running down a coded column of dates and symbols. Rowan continued, his voice a low monotone, a recitation of tactical facts. "The main freight spur to Iron Wheel Junction is here, east of the river. That's Creed's artery. He controls everything that moves on it, but there's an old telegraph line that follows the river. Not the track. It's mostly unused, but the wire is still there." "Iron Wheel Junction," Mira murmured, her eyes scanning the ledger. "August 12th, a shipment of mining equipment listed, but the recipient code, it's not a mine, it's the county courthouse." Rowan's hand stilled. He looked at her. She tapped the page. "And here, September 1st, a church auction in Tyrrell County." That was the day after the big fire at the Miller Ranch. "I remember, because they brought 2 of the children in with smoke inhalation. The parents didn't make it." She pulled one of her loose notes from the satchel, her own handwriting a sharp, angry slant. "The Miller Ranch, foreclosed, sold at auction, and the deed, it's noted here." She pointed to a set of symbols in the ledger, signed by Judge Ephraim Dodd. Rowan's face hardened. "Dodd, he signs every deed, every foreclosure. He's the county adjudicator for water rights. He's Creed's pen," Mira said, her voice dropping. "Creed is the gun, and Dodd is the law that makes the killing legal." Rowan stepped back from the table, the half-drawn map suddenly a testament to his own blindness. It was all there, laid out like a chessboard. He saw the pattern he had been too grief-stricken to recognize. "They choke them," he said, his voice rough. He connected the lines on his own map. Creed's men Pike, the Derns they find a way to divert the water. A small dam, a dynamited culvert. The ranch struggles. The bank, which Creed controls, calls in the note. The rancher fights, he dies, or he gives up. Either way, Judge Dodd signs the paper. He looked at Mira, the full, sickening scope of it finally settling on him. "The widows, the settlement escorts you mentioned, they're pressured," Mira said, her own face pale. "Offered a pittance, and safe passage west. They're shipped out on the freight line." Their land absorbed into Creed's holdings before the ink is even dry. They become ghosts, erased. Rowan closed his eyes for a second. Caleb hadn't just been killed in an accident. He had been an obstacle. His ranch, his water rights, his prime land he had been cleared from the board. This wasn't just a land grab. It was a harvest of sorrow, a systematic erasure of an entire community, one family at a time, and he had been next. When he opened his eyes, the fatigue was gone, replaced by a cold. Still purpose, a plan. Then, he said, he picked up the charcoal. We can't kill them all. We have to expose them. We have to cut the head off the snake. The snake has 2 heads, Mira said. Creed in the rail yard, Dodd in the courthouse, and the body is the freight line, and the telegraph. Rowan drew a new line, one that skirted the bluffs, a hunter's path. We need to get this ledger to someone who matters. Someone Creed can't buy. The Shade Bluff newspaper, Mira offered, the Wyoming Territorial Gazette. If it's printed, it becomes real. People will have to see it. Ephra Rook, he's the printer. Rowan nodded, stubborn as a mule. He might do it, but he'll need more than a coded book. He'll need proof. He'll need the law on his side. The law is Judge Dodd, Mira countered, frustration in her voice. The local law. Rowan corrected. But you said it yourself. Creed is shipping men, guns, dynamite. He's using the telegraph to coordinate. He's using the United States mail to send those forged foreclosure notices. That's not county business. That's a federal crime. Mira's eyes lit up. Mail fraud. Of course. It gives jurisdiction to the U.S. postal inspectors. Do you know one? I know of one? Mira said. Helen Morrissey. They call her the Iron Postmistress. She was in Cheyenne investigating a land grant scheme. They say she can't be bought, can't be threatened, and she hates thieves more than she hates the cold. If she gets this, she'll build a case that will stand up in a federal court, not Dodd's kangaroo court. The plan began to form, pieces clicking into place. It was a 3-pronged attack. First, the telegraph, Rowan said, pointing to the line on his map. We can't let Creed use it to call for reinforcements, or to warn Dodd. We have to seize the line. Cut him off. I can't run a line and ride to Shade Bluff at the same time. Mira said, You won't have to. Rowan thought for a moment, his gaze distant. I have allies, people who've been waiting. People who owe Creed nothing but grief. He tapped the map. Noah Calderon. They call him String. He's a fiddler, mostly. But he was a linesman in the war. He knows every inch of that wire. Creed's land grab ran his cousin out of the county. He'll do it. He's been waiting for a reason. We need more than a linesman. We need a town that will stand up. Then we need my Aunt Rhea, Rowan said. A rare, thin smile touched his lips. Rhea Beckett. She's a midwife. She delivered half the babies in this county and sat with the dying in the other half. She holds more trust in her little finger than Creed holds in his entire bank vault. When she speaks, people listen. If she rallies the ranch wives, the ones who've been threatened, they'll show up. They'll be our witnesses. A midwife and a fiddler against Haggard Pike Mira looked doubtful. Not just them. Rowan's expression sobered. There's Reverend Whitlock. He's got a loud conscience and a small spine, but he is the town's moral center. If he sees the proof, if we can give him the courage, he'll denounce Creed from the pulpit. He'll give the people permission to be angry. He paced, his limp more pronounced. And there's one more, Corporal Jonah Leving. He's a Buffalo soldier, detached to the rail security detail. He's a good man, a man of duty, disgusted by the graft he sees every day. He's supposed to be protecting Creed's property, but he hates him. If we give him a lawful reason, a federal warrant, he and his men will follow the law, not the money. The plan was set. Seize the telegraph line to cut off Creed. Get the ledger and Mira's translations to the Gazette in Shade Bluff. At the same time, get a copy of the evidence to Inspector Morrissey and secure federal warrants. Then, with Leving's authority and Aunt Rhea's popular support, arrest Dodd and Creed. It's too much, Rowan said, stopping. We can't do it all. We have to split up. I'll ride to Shade Bluff. You find Morrissey. Mira shook her head. her expression absolute. "No, you'll be safer with the inspector. You can't read this," she said, her hand flat on the ledger, not under pressure. "Creed doesn't use one cipher. He uses rolling substitutions, mirror ciphers. The keys change daily, based on freight manifests I memorized. The key isn't in a book. Rowan, it's in my head." She met his gaze, unflinching. "If they catch you with this, it's just a stolen book. You have no proof. If they catch me, they have the key. But I am the only one who can stand in front of that printer, Ephra Rook, and translate this. I am the only one who can make it talk. I'm leading the evidence run to Shade Bluff. I have to." Rowan studied her for a long time. The half-drowned woman was gone. The nurse was gone. This was someone else, a strategist, a survivor. He saw the iron in her spine and knew he could not bend it, and he knew she was right. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with a new respect. "You ride to Shade Bluff. I'll find Calderon and Leving, and then I'll find Morrissey. She was last seen at Red Feather's depot." He walked to the large wooden chest at the foot of his cot. It was locked. He retrieved a key from a hook high on the wall and opened it. The smell of gun oil and old leather filled the air. This was not his daily use gear. This was Caleb's, and his own. From his trail boss days. He lifted out a holstered pistol. It was a Colt Navy, its steel a dull, oiled blue, its walnut grip smooth. It was perfectly balanced. He laid it on the table. "You know how to use this." Mira didn't just say yes. She picked it up. Her movements were fluid, economical. She checked the load in the cylinder, her thumb expertly pulling the hammer back to half-cock. She tested the action, her ear tilted, listening to the solid, satisfying click-click-click as the cylinder turned. Her fingers, which had been so steady binding his ankle, were just as steady on the trigger. She handled the weapon like a pianist touching a familiar keyboard. "I was a telegraph operator in a town that didn't have a sheriff," she said, her voice dry. She slid the pistol into the holster and buckled the belt around her narrow waist, over his flannel shirt. It looked impossibly large and impossibly dangerous. Rowan nodded, impressed. He reached back into the chest and pulled out a shorter weapon, a Spencer carbine, its stock scarred but its action clean. For distance, it's reliable, and it's loaded. She took that, too, testing its weight, working the lever action smoothly, sighting down the barrel at the cabin door. She nodded. "It'll do. We can't ride the main road," Rowan said, moving to the door. "Pike's men will be watching it. We'll have to take the Mustangs." He led her outside. The rain had stopped, but the air was cold and heavy. The ground was a sea of mud. In a small, sturdy corral stood 2 horses. They weren't large, but they were tough. Lean Mustangs, one a dark, flint gray, the other a nervous, reddish-brown, Flint and Wren. Rowan said, "They're smart, and they're quiet." He put 2 fingers to his lips and gave a low, 2-note whistle, barely louder than the wind. The horse's ears pricked. He gave a soft click with his tongue, and the gray, Flint, walked directly to the fence. "We trained them for hunting in the breaks," he said. "Low clicks, hand signals, no shouting. You'll take Wren. She's fast, and she has more stamina than she looks." As they began to saddle the horses, their hands working together on buckles and straps, Mira glanced at the far ridge. A dark shape, a lone rider, was silhouetted against the pewter sky. Too far to see clearly, but the shape was wrong. It wasn't a rancher. The man sat his horse with a stillness, an arrogance. He was watching. "Rowan," she said, her voice low. He'd already seen him. "He's not close enough to be a threat. He's a scout." He tightened a cinch with a vicious pull. The rumors must be true. What rumors? That Creed's brought in new men, not just local thugs like the Derns, men in black bowler hats, with brass badges, paid to look like Pinkerton agents, but they answer to no one but Creed. Their only job is to make examples, to stop anyone from even thinking about standing in his way. The rider on the ridge turned his horse and vanished over the crest. The threat was no longer abstract. It was here. It was watching. They finished their preparations in silence. They packed jerky, hardtack, and 2 full canteens. Mira tucked the ledger, wrapped again in its oilskin, deep into her saddlebag, the carbine sliding into the scabbard beside it, as the weak sun began its descent, casting long, cold shadows. Rowan went back inside the house. Mira followed, watching as he took the green glass lantern from the table. He grabbed a hammer and a long iron nail from his toolbox. He went to the doorway, standing on a small stool. He placed the brass ring of the lantern's handle against the heavy beam above the door, and with 2 solid, echoing blows, he hammered the nail through it, securing the lamp to the house itself. It hung there, a beacon of color against the weathered gray wood. He lit the wick. The familiar honeyed light spilled out onto the muddy porch. "What are you doing?" Mira asked. "It's a signal," Rowan said, his back to her. His voice was quiet. The words meant more for himself. "Home lit. It's an old trail sign, for riders coming back in the dark, so they can find their way, so they know the watch is being kept." He stepped down from the stool and turned to face her. The green light illuminated the lines on his face, the deep, fresh pain in his eyes. "I haven't lit it for anyone since Caleb," he said. "It'll stay lit until you're back, until this is done." It was a promise. A vigil, a declaration of war, lit by the single, fragile flame of his family's past, now shining out into the hostile dark of the Wyoming Territory. The night swallowed them. They rode north, not on any road, but through a trackless sea of sagebrush that silvered and hissed in a wind that had no origin and no destination. The darkness was absolute, a cold, heavy blanket that muffled the world. Above, the stars were sharp, indifferent chips of ice in black velvet. The only sounds were the steady, muffled thud-thud of the Mustang's hooves on the dry earth and the constant, soft shush of the brush against their legs. Rowan led, his body a dark shape on the flint-gray Mustang. He navigated by the shape of the ridges against the skyline, by the feel of the land beneath him. He was a man remade. His grief burned down to a hard, cold coal of purpose. Every sense was alive. He tasted the dust, smelled the distant alkali of the dry flats, and listened. He listened past the wind, past the horses, listening for the metallic click of a shod hoof on stone, for the dislodged pebble, for the cough of a man. Behind him, Mira rode Wren. She held the Spencer carbine across her lap, its metal cold against her legs. The reins were looped in one hand. Her hands, wrapped in their clean cotton bandages, ached. She was not a rider like Rowan. She was a woman of wires, ciphers, and sick rooms. Her body was a catalog of new pains: her thighs, her back, her shoulders. But she rode on. The silence was a presence, and the sheer, unending emptiness of the territory pressed in on her. To calm the tremor in her hands, she began to hum. It was a sound so low it was barely audible, a vibration in her own chest, an old hymn, a mighty fortress, a small defiant act of order against the vast, looming chaos. Rowan heard it. He didn't turn. The sound was a thin thread of warmth in the immense cold, a reminder of the woman behind him, of the impossible gamble they were taking. It was the first human sound in this valley, besides his own grim thoughts. In 2 years, after an hour, he raised a gloved hand, a simple, flat gesture. Halt. He dismounted, his movements fluid. Mira stopped, sliding from Wren's back. Her knees nearly buckled. Rowan was already moving, his carbine in hand, toward a shallow dip in the land where a line of willows marked a small, spring-fed watering hole. It was a necessary risk. The horses needed water. He crouched at the edge of the spring, his gaze sweeping. He motioned her forward. She came to his side, leading the horses, while the animals drank, their heads low, their breath pluming. Rowan scanned the ground. The mud at the spring's edge was a ledger, and he knew how to read it. "We aren't the first ones here tonight," he said, his voice a low rumble. Mira looked. In the faint starlight, she saw it. The dark, wet churn of tracks, at least 3 horses, shod, heavy, but it was the smell that caught her. The sharp, acrid scent of wet ash. Rowan moved to a cluster of rocks. The remains of a small, hastily extinguished fire were still visible, the embers black and damp, and in the center, a piece of scorched metal. He picked it up. It was the curved branding iron from a wagon's chuck box. The letters, warped by fire, were still clear. C.C. Creed Company. "They burned their own wagon," Mira whispered, her hand going to the colt on her hip. "Or a wagon that was supposed to be here to meet them," Rowan said. He looked at the ground around the fire. "They were waiting for us." His gaze followed the churned mud leading away from the spring. 3 riders, heavy men, shod boots, he pointed, his finger tracing a line in the dark. "And they're heading for 3 Raven Pass." Mira looked at her own small, hand-drawn copy of Rowan's map. "The pass is the shortcut. It cuts straight to Ironwheel. It's also a box," Rowan said. "Narrow, steep walls, a perfect place for an ambush." He straightened up, his eyes hard. "They're hurting us. They expected us to follow, to take the fastest route." "So we don't," Mira said, understanding immediately. "We go the long way, through Sawhorse Gulch. It's more open, but the ground is broken. More chances to see them before they see us. They'll know we avoided the trap." "Good," Rowan said, a grim set to his jaw. "Let them know we're not cattle." They mounted up and moved out, leaving the spring, the air now tainted with the smell of Creed's malice. Sawhorse Gulch was a jagged scar in the earth, a mile-long cut littered with the skeletons of ancient fallen pines and massive sandstone boulders. It was a maze of shadows, a place where the darkness pooled and thickened. The wind moaned as it passed over the rimrock far above. Rowan led Flint, the horse's hooves making almost no sound on the sandy floor of the wash. They were halfway through when Rowan's hand shot up, the signal to freeze. He didn't move. He sat in the saddle, his head tilted, a statue of pure, focused attention. Then Mira heard it. Bob White, Bob White, a bird call, thin and clear. From the rocks ahead of them, Mira's blood went cold. A Bob White. At midnight, in the freezing cold of a Wyoming autumn. It was a sound so wrong, so deeply unnatural. It was a scream. Rowan was already moving. He slid from the saddle, not in a rush, but with a deliberate, silent grace, his carbine in his hand. He pressed himself against Flint's side, using the horse as a shield. He motioned to her. A sharp, downward gesture. Dismount. Cover. A second sound came, this one much closer. The faint, metallic scrape of a boot heel on shale. Off to their right, high up on the gulch wall. They were in the trap. The signal was from the front. The flanking man was on the right. They were caught in a crossfire. Roa N had shuttered their small lantern, but a thin sliver of light escaped, painting a small circle on the ground. Mira, pulling her own carbine, dropped low, her eyes scanning the rocks to her right. She saw it, a flicker, not a light. It was a tiny cascade of dust, a few grains of sand, falling from a ledge, illuminated as they passed through the sliver of lantern light. A man was there, moving into position. Cole Dern. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She threw herself from Wren's saddle, landing hard on her shoulder, rolling behind a wide, flat boulder. The impact sent a jolt of pain up her arm, but she chambered around, the shuck click of the Spencer sounding impossibly loud. The moment she moved, Rowan acted. He was the trail boss, the master of deception. He knew the ambushers needed a target. He grabbed his own heavy duster, which had been tied behind his saddle, and pulled his hat from his head. He was in the deep shadow of his horse. 10 feet away stood the weathered, gray post of an old drift fence. He lunged, a 2-second blur of motion. He flung the duster over the post. jammed his hat on top. It was a perfect silhouette, a man, standing, looking. He dove for the rocks, just as the night exploded. Crack! A muzzle flashed from the rocks in front of them, where the bird call had come from. The bullet tore through the empty duster, ripping a fist-sized hole in the canvas. Splinters flew from the fence post as a second and third shot chewed it to pieces. Silas Dern was firing, dumping his rifle into the decoy. "Got him," Silas roared, his voice echoing. "No, you don't," Rowan bellowed, his voice aimed in a different direction, drawing their fire. But Cole, the flanking man on the right, wasn't fooled. He saw Mira's dive. He rose from his cover, his rifle coming up, a dark shape against the rock, aiming down at her boulder. Mira saw him. She was pinned. Rowan was pinned. They were blind. "The oil," Rowan yelled. Mira knew instantly, in her saddlebag, which she had grabbed as she fell, was the small tin can of lamp oil. It was half full. The ground between her and Cole Dern was a steep, gravelly slope, littered with dry brush. She didn't throw it. She kicked it, hard. The tin can clattered, tumbling end over end, spinning down the slope, splashing a trail of pungent, flammable oil as it went. It rolled 20 yards, coming to a stop in a patch of tinder-dry greasewood. "Rowan, now!" she screamed. Rowan was already moving. He rose from cover, not at Silas, but at the glint of the can. He brought his Colt up, a single, steady shot. He wasn't aiming for the can. He was aiming for the shale rock beside the can. The shot was deafening in the narrow gulch. The bullet struck the rock, and a single, bright orange spark flared in the darkness. It touched the oil. With a sound like a giant's whoosh, the world lit up. The flame didn't explode. It snaked, a line of brilliant yellow-orange fire that raced up the oil trail, erupting in the patch of greasewood with a hungry roar. It was a sudden, violent wall of light, illuminating the gulch in a flickering, hellish glare. The fire spread, but as Rowan knew it would, it immediately ran into a wide, bare stretch of granite, a natural fire break he had counted on. It wouldn't spread dangerously. It would light up the kill box for 30 seconds, and in that light, Cole Dern was caught. He was exposed, halfway down the slope, his rifle raised. His face, pale and whiskered, was a mask of pure, idiotic surprise. Rowan didn't wait. He leveled his carbine. He fired once. He was not a murderer, but he was a man protecting his life. He aimed for the shoulder. The bullet hit with a wet, heavy thwack. Cole screamed, a high, thin sound, and his rifle clattered onto the rocks. He grabbed his shoulder, staggering back, his silhouette stark against the flames. From the front, Silas Dern, blinded by the sudden light and panicked by his brother's scream, rose from his cover. He swung his rifle toward Rowan, fumbling with the trigger. Click, the rifle was empty. He had spent his load on the decoy. He stared at the useless weapon in his hands, his mouth open. "Silas Cole, get out. Get out now." The voice was new. It was a deep, gravelly roar from high above them, from the rim of the gulch. Haggard Pike, the leader, he had been watching the entire time. A new sound joined the crackle of the fire, a harsh, grating, caw, 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 a crow croak, a signal. Silas didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his brother, grabbing him by his good arm. He began to drag the moaning, wounded man back into the shadows, away from the light. As they retreated, Haggard Pike's voice boomed down from the darkness, a threat and a promise. "This ain't over, Beckett. You hear me? Creed says the girl returns, or the river turns off for the whole county. We'll dry you out. We'll turn Ash River to a ditch of dust. You'll all be begging for a dipper of water by sundown." The voice faded, swallowed by the wind. Then there was only the sound of the dying fire and the fading, frantic scramble of the two men disappearing into the night. Silence. The flames guttered, shrinking back to embers, and the oppressive darkness of the gulch rushed back in. Rowan stood, his rifle still pointed at the shadows. He was breathing hard, the smell of gunpowder and burning oil sharp in his nostrils. He turned to Mira. She was leaning against the boulder, the Spencer carbine held loosely in her hands. Her face was pale, streaked with soot. Her entire body was shaking, a violent, uncontrollable tremor of adrenaline and shock. She had faced him down. She had held her ground, and now, the cost of it was catching up to her. Rowan walked to her. He saw the tremor, the wide, staring eyes. He didn't speak. He simply reached out his large, gloved hand and placed it on her shoulder. The hand was heavy. It was solid. It was an anchor in the swirling dark. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't kind. It was just there, steady, grounding. It said, "We are alive. We are still standing. Breathe." Mira leaned into the pressure for a single, shuddering moment. She closed her eyes, drew in a long, ragged breath that smelled of smoke, and let it out. When she opened her eyes, the panic was gone. The tremor in her hands stilled. She straightened, pushing away from the rock, and his hand fell away. She was back. "They're gone," she said, her voice a rough whisper. "For now." Rowan moved, his trail boss instincts taking over again. He walked to where Cole Dern had fallen. He kicked at the rocks, his eyes scanning. "He dropped something," he said. He knelt and picked up a dark object. It was a heavy leather courier pouch, the kind used for official dispatches. It had fallen from Cole's belt. Rowan unbuckled the flap. Inside was not money. It was a single, folded document, bound with twine and sealed with a thick dollop of dark red wax. Rowan took it, turning it over in his hand. He went to the small, shuttered lantern and opened the slit, letting the light fall on the seal. His breath hitched. The signet, pressed deep into the wax, was unmistakable. It was a miner's spade, but its handle was topped with a small, stylized crown. The crowned spade. The dispatch was addressed, in elegant script, to Judge Ephraim Dodd, Terrell County Courthouse. They had it. The link, the direct order from Creed to Dodd, carried by the men who had just tried to kill them. Rowan was about to tuck it into his own pocket when Mira gasped, her voice sharp. "Rowan, look." She wasn't looking at the pouch. She was staring up at the other ridge, the one opposite from where Haggard Pike had been. "What?" he said, his eyes scanning the black line of the rimrock. "I don't see anything." "There," she insisted, her voice low and tense. "I saw it. A flash. Just for a second." He stared, squinting into the darkness. Nothing. Just the moon on wet rock, Mira, the fire. "No," she said, her voice dropping, all the certainty in the world in that one word. It wasn't a reflection. It was a lens, like a spyglass, or a mirror, signaling. It was precise. They both stood frozen, the pouch in Rowan's hand suddenly feeling heavy and cold. The wind howled over the ridge, a low, mournful sound. The Derns were brutes. Haggard Pike was a thug. They had survived them, but someone else was out there in the dark. Someone who hadn't fired a shot. Someone who hadn't shouted a threat. Someone who was disciplined and patient. Someone who was just watching. A professional. They weren't just being hunted anymore. They were being observed. And that, Rowan knew, was infinitely more dangerous. They rode back to the half-lantern in a state of high, ragged tension, the silence of the night now seeming to crawl with unseen eyes. The adrenaline from the firefight had curdled into a cold, metallic dread. They were not just fugitives anymore. They were combatants, and they had a prisoner. Cole Dern, his shoulder clumsily bandaged with a strip of his own shirt, was slumped over his saddle, his wrists bound to the horn. He was semi-conscious, moaning with every jolt of the horse. They had retrieved him from the rocks, along with the courier pouch, in a frantic, desperate scramble before Silas or Pike could return. Rowan led the prisoner's horse, his carbine balanced across his lap, his gaze sweeping the ridges. He was acutely aware of the mirror flash Mira had seen. They were being watched, and he felt a cold certainty that their observer had let them take the prisoner, let them take the pouch. as a cat lets a mouse think it has escaped. As they cleared the last rise, the ranch house came into view. The single green glass lamp Rowan had nailed above the door was burning, a small, defiant point of color in the vast, oppressive dark. But there was another light. A warm yellow square glowed from the window, and a thread of white smoke rose from the chimney. Rowan reined in, his hand tightening on his rifle. "Stay here," he hissed at Mira. He dismounted, sliding from Flint's back like a shadow. He moved low and fast, using the corral fence as cover, his eyes fixed on that unexpected light. He reached the porch, pressing his back to the wall, and listened. He heard a low voice and the scrape of a metal spoon against an iron pot. He kicked the door open, his carbine leveled, sweeping the room. The woman at the stove didn't even flinch. She was short, square, and weathered, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She turned from the stove, a large wooden spoon in her hand, and fixed him with a look of profound disappointment. "Rowan Beckett," she snapped, her voice as sharp as a fresh frost. "Is that how you greet family? You're lucky I didn't scald you. And you—" She pointed the spoon at Mira, who was now visible in the doorway. "You must be the guest. Lord in heaven, girl, you look half-starved." "Aunt Rhea," Rowan breathed, lowering the carbine. The relief was so sudden it made him dizzy. "Don't you Aunt Rhea me," she said, turning back to the stove, where a massive pot of stew bubbled, filling the cold cabin with the rich scent of beef, onions, and thyme. "I came to check on you after the storm, and what do I find? This house colder than a banker's heart, and a guest you've been feeding with nothing but storm day rations. I found the traces of those corn griddle cakes. Shameful. No Beckett is that poor a host." Rowan, the man who had just survived a firefight, found himself at a complete loss for words. Mira stepped inside, her gaze moving from Rowan's formidable aunt to the pot of stew. Rhea Beckett sized her up in a second. "Well, get in. And who's that you left bleeding on the horse? Or do I need to set another plate for supper?" Rowan and Mira carried Cole Dern inside. He was heavier than he looked, and his good arm thrashed weakly. "Tie him to the chair," Rowan ordered, his voice hard. "The one in the corner." As they secured him, Cole's eyes fluttered open, wide and feverish with pain and terror. He stared at Rowan, at the ledger on the table, at the hard-faced woman by the fire. You'll get nothin' from me," he spat, but his voice was thin. Pike'll come. He'll burn this place to the ground with you in it." "He can try," Rowan said, checking the ropes. "He'll live, or he won't. I don't much care which." "Rowan," Mira said, her voice quiet but firm. She was already at the stove, taking a cloth and a basin. "Get me that kettle of boiled water, please." She approached the prisoner, and Cole shrank back, expecting a blow. "Get away from me, you!" "Hold still," Mira commanded, her nurse's voice cutting through his panic. "This will hurt, but if you want to keep that arm, you won't fight me." He watched her, his eyes narrowed, as she cut away the soiled bandage. The wound was ugly, a dark, puckered hole, scorched black at the edges from the powder burns. Cole hissed in a breath, bracing himself. Mira's hands were gentle, but efficient. She cleaned the wound with a detachment that was almost unnerving. Cole was trembling, but she ignored it. "The bullet went clean through," she said, her voice clinical, as if she were describing a piece of machinery. "You were lucky. It missed the bone." She applied a thick, stinging antiseptic from Rhea's bag. Cole cried out, a short, sharp sound. "But the powder burns," she continued, her voice low as she wrapped his shoulder in clean linen. "They're deep, if you don't keep this clean, and I mean boiled water clean. The skin will pull tight when it scars. It will twist your arm up so you can't ever raise it past your belt. You'll be useless." Cole stared at her. He had expected threats. He had expected pain. He had not expected practical, medical advice. This woman, this ghost they'd been hunting, had just saved his arm from ruin. He looked from her focused, serious face to Rowan's hard, cold expression. The first seed of doubt, tiny and bitter, began to sprout in his mind. A heavy booted step on the porch made Rowan spin. The carbine coming up again. The door opened, and a tall man in the blue uniform of the 9th Cavalry stepped inside, ducking his head to clear the frame. He was on furlough, his jacket unbuttoned, but his bearing was all military. "Corporal Jonah Leving," he said, nodding to Rowan. His gaze took in the room Aunt Rhea, the stew, the bound prisoner, and the armed woman. "Rhea's message said you found trouble. Rowan, looks like you found a whole hive of it." "Jonah," Rowan said, relaxing slightly. He trusted Leving. He was a man of deep conscience, disgusted by the graft he was forced to overlook while guarding Creed's rail shipments. "I'm here on my own time," Leving said, removing his hat. "But I brought news. I came from Red Feather's depot. The U.S. Postal Inspector, Helen Morrissey. She's in the territory. She's asking questions, quiet ones, about forged land notices and mail that never arrived in this county." Rowan and Mira exchanged a look. Their desperate gamble was a real possibility. "We have what she needs," Rowan said, tapping the ledger. Before he could continue, another man shuffled in from behind Leving, looking as if he'd been dragged there. It was Reverend Whitlock, his thin face pale, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. He had clearly been summoned by Rhea. "Rhea, this is madness," he stammered, his eyes wide at the sight of Cole Dern. "A prisoner in your house. Rowan, this is vigilantism. This is not the way of the Lord. We must trust in the law. We must trust in Judge Dodd." Aunt Rhea slammed the stew ladle down on the table, making the tin plates jump. The room fell silent. "Ephraim Dodd," she snapped, her voice low and dangerous. "That man wouldn't know justice if it bit him on the nose. Reverend, I respect your cloth, and I respect your faith. But the good book ain't a leash for wolves. It's a map for shepherds, and our flock." Her gaze swept the room, landing on Mira. "Is being slaughtered. I will not stand by and pray for a wolf to become a lamb. We will act." The Reverend Whitlock, thoroughly chastened, sank into a chair by the hearth, speechless. The moral debate was over. The room was united. Another man slipped in, having waited for the argument to finish. He was wiry, with quick eyes and the long, clever fingers of a musician. "String," Rowan nodded. "You made it? Noah String Calderon." The fiddler turned linesman, looked at the prisoner and whistled. "Looks like the dance has already started. Rowan, I hope you saved a turn for me." "Jonah, String," Rowan said, his voice all business. "This is Mira Solis. She's the one who brought us the proof." Mira opened the ledger. The men leaned in. "It's a cipher," she explained. "It's how Creed hides his shipments, his payments, his entire operation." "How do we read it?" Leving asked, his soldier's mind focusing on the tactical problem. "He's clever," Mira said, her finger tracing a line of code. "He doesn't use one key. He rotates it, based on manifests I memorized. For this week, it's every third consonant in the shipping register. BC, D, D maps to dynamite, F, G, H maps to Haggard Pike's hired guns." "So it's a pay ledger?" String asked. "More than that," Mira said, turning a page. "Look here. This column is labeled tons of ballast. It's not ballast. It's water, acre-feet of water, calculated and valued. He's not just stealing land. He's tracking his inventory." The men were silent, the full, cold, and calculated evil of the plan settling on them. The mood in the room was heavy, thick with the coming violence. Rowan knew they couldn't go into this divided or scared. They needed to be a team. "Outside," he ordered. "In the barn. We can't be shouting at each other in the dark. We need signals." The sun was just setting, casting long, dramatic shadows from the barn doors. Rowan began to drill them, using the light and dark. He showed them the hand signals he'd used on the trail. A flat palm held up, "Stop," a low sweeping motion, "Get down," a circling finger, "Flanking." From the right, They were simple, effective, and silent. Mira watched, her arms crossed. "That's good," she said. "But it's slow. On the telegraph, we do this." She stepped up to a wooden railing and tapped her fingers, her hand a blur. Dit dit dit. Danger. Da. Dit. Enemy ahead. The rhythms were sharp, complex, and unmistakable. String Calderon, the fiddler, grinned. "Now that's music I understand." Rowan frowned, trying to imitate her rapid, staccato taps. His large, calloused fingers, used to rope and iron, were hopelessly clumsy. He produced a series of dull, arrhythmic thuds. Clump, clack, clack, clump. String snorted. "Boss, you've got the rhythm of a broken wagon wheel." Rowan scowled and tried again, concentrating, but only produced a sound like a horse trying to knock on a door. Mira covered her mouth, but a sound escaped, a sharp, clear peal of genuine laughter. It was a sound as unexpected as the stew, bright and warm, and it shattered the tension in the barn. Rowan stopped, stunned by the sound. He looked at her, at the life in her eyes, and a slow, rusty smile cracked his own face. It was the first time he had smiled, truly smiled, in 2 years. "All right, telegrapher," he said, his voice rough. "You teach him. I'll stick to the map." The ice was broken. The heavy, dark cloud of fear had lifted, replaced by the warmth of shared purpose, even shared humor. They were no longer just survivors. They were a company. Later that night, the house was quiet. Leving and String sat at the table, guarding the prisoner and poring over Mira's notes. Aunt Rhea and the Reverend had gone, riding into town under the cover of darkness to begin their work. Rowan stood on the porch, staring out into the night. The green glass lamp, his mother's lamp, glowed steadily above him. He heard the soft footfall and knew it was Mira. She came to stand beside him, not touching, just sharing the small space. "You were good," he said, his voice low, "with Cole, and in the barn." "You were terrible," she replied, the ghost of her laugh still in her voice. They stood in a comfortable silence, the night air cold and clean. The tension from the barn, the easy camaraderie, had shifted into something else. The air between them was close, charged. He could smell the lye soap from Rhea's pot on her skin, and the faint, sharp scent of gun oil. "Mira," he began, but he didn't know what to say. He only knew that after 2 years of desolate, crushing loneliness, her presence was like water on parched land. He felt a deep, pulling need to close the small distance between them. She must have felt it too. She turned to face him. In the soft green light, he saw the exhaustion in her face, but also the iron. She saw the raw, exposed loneliness in his, and the new, fragile desire that was just beneath it. She made the first move, but it was not the one he expected. She didn't step back. She raised her bandaged hand and placed it gently, firmly, against his jaw. His beard stubble was rough against her palm. It was a gesture of incredible, arresting intimacy, and at the same time, a boundary. Rowan froze, his own hands clenching at his sides. He closed his eyes, his breath hitching, and leaned his forehead against hers. They stood like that, joined only by her hand and their proximity, the lamp glowing between them. "Rowan," she whispered, her voice steady. "We have to be clear. We have to survive tomorrow. This—" Her other hand made a small gesture in the space between their bodies. "This can't be what it wants to be. Not yet. We have to have clear heads." He didn't try to kiss her. He didn't try to pull her closer. He honored the line she had drawn. He covered her hand with his own, pressing her palm more tightly against his face for a single, grateful second. "Not yet," he agreed, his voice hoarse. He let out a long, shuddering breath. "But it's good to not be alone." "You're not," she said. He stepped back, slowly, letting his hand fall away. The moment was over, but the bond was sealed. It was desire, yes, but it was threaded with a steel core of respect. They went back inside, their faces set. The brief warmth of the porch was gone, replaced by the cold reality of the plan. Rowan unrolled his hand-drawn map. "The plan is locked," he said, his voice clear and commanding. The team looked up. "Aunt Rhea and the Reverend are already moving. They'll rally the widows for a showdown at the courthouse. They'll be our voice." He turned to the two men. "Leving, String, you ride for Red Feather's depot. Now, you find Inspector Morrissey." He handed Leving the sealed courier pouch. "This is her probable cause. Give her this, and give her these." He handed String a copy of Mira's cipher keys. "The pouch gets her here. The keys are her weapon. Tell her to meet us in Shade Bluff, and tell her to bring warrants, and every man she has." Leving and Calderon nodded, their faces grim. They tucked the documents away, grabbed their rifles, and were gone in a cloud of cold night air. Rowan turned back to Mira. His eyes met hers. All business now. "Me and you," he said. "We're taking the ledger. We're riding to Shade Bluff." He looked at the prisoner, Cole, who was watching them with wide, feverish, and deeply conflicted eyes. "We're going to see a printer," Rowan said, his voice like iron. "We're going to burn Barlow Creed to the ground." They rode Wren and Flint hard, using the ridges and dry washes, pushing the Mustangs to their limit until the first, pale gray suggestion of dawn threatened the eastern horizon. They left the horses, lathered and breathing hard, in a box canyon miles from any settlement, hobbled with enough grass and water for a day. They walked the last 3 miles to a lonely way station on the territorial coach line. In the pre-dawn chill, they transformed themselves. Aunt Rhea's network had been thorough. She had left a bundle for them with the way station's taciturn stable hand, a man who owed her his daughter's life. Rowan emerged from the barn not as a rancher, but as a middling wheat buyer from the east, a man named Silas Culpepper. The suit was cheap wool, a size too large in the shoulders and too short in the arms, in a truly awful shade of brown plaid. He wore a cracked bowler hat and carried a silver-topped flask in his breast pocket, from which he took periodic, ostentatious sips of cold tea. He affected a slight, rolling stagger, the gait of a man who found the world perpetually amusing and slightly out of focus. He had the ledger, wrapped in oilcloth, tucked deep in his carpetbag, hidden beneath a layer of feed catalogs. Mira's transformation was more profound. She emerged as a freight widow. Aunt Rhea had provided a dress of severe, slate-gray cotton, worn thin at the elbows but spotlessly clean. Its high collar and tight cuffs were brutally practical. The centerpiece was the bonnet. It was a deep, concealing scoop of black straw, lined with slate-gray cloth, that shadowed her face, rendering her features anonymous, a mere suggestion of a woman lost in grief. She was Mrs. Aris, traveling to Shade Bluff to settle the accounts of her late husband, a man who had supposedly fallen from a freight wagon. She clutched a worn reticule, her back rigid with performative sorrow, before they stepped out of the barn's shadow. Mira paused. She lifted her skirt an inch, revealing the plain cotton stocking on her calf. From her reticule, she removed the crowned spade seal, the heavy wax disc attached to its dispatch. She slipped the cold, incriminating object beneath the band of her garter, positioning it high on her thigh. It was a cold, hard weight against her skin, a secret that was both her shield and her greatest liability. "Mrs. Aris," Rowan slurred, offering his arm with a sloppy flourish. "Mr. Culpepper," she replied, her voice flat and cold. She took his arm, and they walked, a mismatched, convincing pair of travelers, toward the arriving coach. The night coach was a lumbering, mud-splattered beast, its lanterns casting weak, yellow circles. They boarded, finding the interior thick with the smell of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the faint, sour odor of the gambler sleeping in the far corner. A young woman, a seamstress by the look of her needle-pricked fingers, sat opposite them, her eyes wide and nervous. Mira gave her a curt, widow's nod, and then turned to stare out the window, her bonnet a fortress wall. Rowan tipped his flask to the driver, offered a slurred greeting, and immediately appeared to doze off, his chin on his chest. For hours, the coach rocked and swayed, a small, dark world hurtling through the cold. Rowan was not sleeping. Mira was not grieving. Beneath the hat, his eyes were slitted, watching the road. Behind the bonnet, her ears were strained, listening to the hoofbeats of the team, listening for the sound of pursuit. The ticking clock of their plan was the rhythmic thud-clack jingle of the harness and the groan of the axles. At midnight, they reached Cinder Rain Bridge. It was a narrow, railless span over a deep, black-water creek. The coach slowed, the horses snorting, and then jolted to a stop. "Who?" There the driver yelled, his voice tight. Lanterns flared outside, bright and blinding. 2 men stood in the road, blocking the bridge. A third was at the driver's seat. Rail agents. The third man announced, his voice a low growl. "Routine inspection for contraband. Everyone out. Papers ready." Rowan's hand, hidden by his coat, tightened. Mira's hand, in her lap, clenched into a fist. The gambler woke with a curse. The young seamstress let out a small, terrified sound. Rowan watched the men through the window. They wore long black dusters, black bowler hats, and gleaming brass badges that read CC Freight Security. They were the Pinkerton lookalikes, Creed's private army, and then Rowan saw their boots. In the lantern light, the boots were pristine, black, polished leather, reflecting the flame. This was mud country. The road was a river of it. No one who had ridden for more than 10 minutes had clean boots. These men hadn't been riding. They had been waiting. Rowan let his head loll. Accidentally, nudging Mira. She saw his gaze flicker down. She glanced, saw the boots, and her breath caught. This was the trap. The door was pulled open. Out. Now. One of the men barked. The gambler stumbled out, raising his hands. The seamstress was crying, fumbling for her papers. The agent's lantern shone on Rowan, still asleep. "You, drummer, get out," Rowan snorted, pretending to wake. "What? What's the trouble?" "Officer just trying to get to Shade Bluff. Sell a little wheat. Out. Now." "Hands where I can see 'em." "Rowan," Mira whispered. So low it was just a breath. The ledger. He couldn't take the carpet bag out. He'd be searched. He couldn't leave it. This was the moment. The improvisation. Mira moved first. She did not step out as a meek widow. She erupted from the coach like a fury. Her black bonnet a war banner. "Absolutely not," she snapped. Her voice high and laced with the steel of her New Orleans finishing school. She swatted the agent's hand away. "How dare you? I am a woman in mourning. I am on my way to settle my late husband's affairs. And you halt this coach like common highwaymen." The agent, stunned by this sudden, upper-class assault, took a step back. "Ma'am, we're just rail agents. We need to see your papers." "My papers?" she scoffed, feigning an outrage so profound it was almost regal. "You will show me your travel papers. What is your jurisdiction? Who is your commanding officer? I demand to know the meaning of this interruption." "I shall have your badge for this." "I assure you." She was magnificent. She was a whirlwind of righteous indignation, a small, gray tempest that had both agents on the road completely flummoxed. They were thugs, paid to intimidate ranchers and bully drifters. They had no script for a high-strung society widow demanding their credentials. "Ma'am, you need to calm," the first agent began. Posturing. "I will not calm. This is an outrage," while all eyes were on Mira. Rowan stumbled from the coach. He swayed, the picture of a drunk trying to navigate a difficult step. Now, lady, be nice to the nice officers." He stumbled past the agents, who were focused on Mira. He staggered toward the side of the coach, near the large rear wheel, fumbling in his pocket. "Got my flask here." "Have a drink, officer." Smooths the nerves. He was perfectly positioned. His clumsy, drunken hand brushed against the coach's undercarriage. His fingers found the brake pin, a heavy, L-shaped bar of iron that held the brake block in place. Mira saw him. She raised her voice, pointing a finger at the lead agent. "I will report you to the governor. I will report you to the territorial marshal. Now." Rowan grunted, not as a command, but as an exertion. With a single, desperate heave, he ripped the heavy iron pin free. The coach, sitting on the slight, downward incline of the bridge, gave a terrible groan. The driver, distracted by the man at his side, hadn't set the main brake. The coach lurched, rolling forward 5 yards. It happened in a second. The horses panicked. The driver screamed. The 2 agents on the road leaped back. The agent at the driver's seat was thrown off balance, his pistol clearing his holster. He fired, a single, panicked shot. The bullet didn't hit anyone. It shattered the single coach lantern, the one illuminating the entire scene. Crack tinkle, the world vanished. Darkness, absolute and total, slammed down on the bridge, broken only by the panicked whinnying of the horses and the shouts of the men. The misdirection was complete. The chaos was total. Rowan didn't hesitate. He held the heavy, 4-pound brake pin in his hand. A dark shape, one of the agents, lunged at him, cursing. "You did that? You—" Rowan swung the pin. It was not a fencer's move. It was a farmer's. Like swinging a maul, the iron bar connected with the man's side with a sickening, wet thud. The agent crumpled without a sound, his breath leaving him in a single, pained rush. In the same instant, Mira grabbed the terrified seamstress, who was screaming in the road. "Stay down! Stay still!" she hissed, shoving the girl bodily under the axle of the stopped coach, a dark, safe hollow. Now Rowan roared, his voice no longer a drunkard's slur but a trail boss's command. He grabbed her arm. They didn't run down the road. They ran to the side of the bridge. For a heart-stopping second, they stood on the edge, the black water a churning, invisible presence 20 feet below. "Hold the bag," he yelled. He grabbed the carpet bag, and together, they leaped. They hit the water in a freezing, explosive splash that knocked the air from their lungs. The creek was deep, its current fast. Smelling of cold stone and pine, it pulled them under, tore at their clothes, and instantly erased their presence from the bridge. Above, the remaining agents were firing blind into the darkness, their shots cracking harmlessly over the water. They surfaced, gasping, among the thick roots of a cottonwood grove 50 yards downstream. The cold was a physical blow, so intense it was like fire. The horses. Rowan panted, his teeth chattering. He was already moving. They didn't stop. They didn't rest. They circled back, using the creek as cover. The agents' horses were tethered 100 yards from the bridge. The men were in disarray, shouting, relighting lanterns, trying to calm the coach team. They hadn't even missed their prisoner. Stealing the horses was almost laughably easy. Rowan, his hands numb, cut 2 of them free. They mounted, their wet clothes freezing to their skin, and vanished into the cottonwoods, the shouts from the bridge fading behind them. They were alive. They were free. And they had the ledger. They rode into Shade Bluff an hour before dawn. 2 half-frozen riders on stolen horses. They looked like refugees from a flood, which, in a way, they were. They skirted the main street, sticking to the alleys, and found the small, dark storefront of the Wyoming Territorial Gazette. They hammered on the back door. A light appeared. The door opened a crack, revealing a man in a nightshirt, holding a shotgun. He was older, his hair a wild, ink-stained white, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "We're closed," he snapped. "Are you Efra Rook?" Rowan asked, his voice raw. "Who's asking?" "My name is Rowan Beckett. This is Mira Solis. We have proof that Barlow Creed and Judge Dodd are stealing the county, and we think they murdered my brother." The door opened wider. Efra Rook's eyes scanned the alley. He saw their desperate, half-frozen state, the seriousness in their faces. He lowered the shotgun. "Get in, and be quiet." The print shop was a warm, cluttered cave, smelling of hot metal, ink, and paper. A massive flatbed press dominated the room. Rook bolted the door behind them, his movements short and angry. "All right," he said, pouring them both scalding. Bitter coffee from a pot on his small stove. Talk. And it better be good. You're bringing a war to my door. They didn't waste time. Rowan laid the carpet bag on a clear table. Mira, her hands shaking from cold and nerves, unwrapped the oilcloth. She opened the ledger. She pointed to the crowned spade seal, which she'd retrieved from her garter. "This is a dispatch from Creed to Dodd," she said, her voice shaking but her fingers steady. She began to translate, her mind locking onto the ciphers. This date, this code. It's a shipment of dynamite to the Tyrrell County Courthouse. This date, an order for Haggard Pike to clear the culvert at Dead Mare Cut. The same day your paper reported my brother's stampede. Ephra Rook read the ledger, his lips moving. He traced the coded lines, then looked at Mira's translations. His face, already pale, turned the color of old parchment. His ink-stained lips whitened. He had been reporting on these accidents and foreclosures for 2 years, never seeing the pattern. Now, it was laid bare on his table. "This," he whispered, his hands visibly trembling. He was a stubborn man, but he was not a fool. He was terrified. "This is treason. This is a conspiracy that runs the whole territory." He straightened, his fear hardening into a familiar, stubborn anger. "I believe you, son. I believe you, ma'am, but I can't print this." What? Rowan snarled, stepping forward. "Don't you understand?" Rook snapped, tapping the ledger. "This is a cipher. Creed will say you faked it. He'll say it's a forgery. He'll have Judge Dodd sign a warrant for my arrest. I'll be ruined. My press will be seized, and you'll both be swinging from a rope. I can't print accusations. I have to print proof. I need official verification. I need a federal badge to stand behind this ink, or it's just gossip. And in this town, gossip gets you killed." He was right. They had come all this way, only to be stopped by the one thing they couldn't provide: lawful authority. "Then you'll have one." The voice came from the deepest shadows of the print shop, from behind a towering stack of newsprint. Rowan and Mira spun, their hands flying to their weapons. A figure stepped into the lamplight. It was a woman, not much older than Mira. She was dressed in plain, durable men's trousers and a flannel shirt. Her dark hair cut short and practical. Her face was sharp, intelligent, and utterly calm. In her hand, she held a small, official-looking notebook. It was the Watcher from the Gulch, the Mirror Flash. "Who the hell are you?" Rowan demanded. "My name is Ada Fenn," the woman said, her voice as calm and precise as a telegraph key. "I'm an undercover operative. I work for Inspector Helen Morrissey." Rowan and Mira stared, stunned into silence. "I've been shadowing Pike's men for 2 weeks," Ada explained, her eyes on the ledger, "and I've been shadowing you since the firefight at Sawhorse Gulch. I was the one on the ridge. My orders were to observe, to see who had the evidence and who was just a threat. When you took the courier pouch, you became the priority." She stepped to the table, her gaze sharp. "Inspector Morrissey has been building a case on mail fraud for 6 months, but she's been missing the key. The cipher, she has the locks, but you have the key." She pointed to a line of code. "Translate that. The shipment from August 28th. Mira," her mind racing, found the line. "It's 4 crates, surveying tools, shipped to a false name at the Iron Wheel Depot." Ada Fenn smiled, a thin, triumphant expression. "No, it's 4 rifles, 30 rounds, and a payment of $50, delivered to Silas Dern. We intercepted a fragment of that message, but couldn't break it. It matches. This is it. This is the whole thing." Rook, still pale, shook his head. "That's your word. It's not a warrant. It's not Inspector Morrissey's signature. I still can't print. You won't have to wait long," Ada said, turning to him. "Leving and Calderon reached the inspector at Red Feathers Depot 3 hours ago. She has the pouch. She has the keys. She's already routing tomorrow morning's mail run through Shade Bluff personally, under federal guard. She'll be here by noon. And she'll be carrying authenticated federal warrants for the arrest of Judge Ephraim Dodd and Barlow Creed." Rook let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a year. "Warrants. Real ones. Get me those warrants." the old printer said, his voice shaking with a newfound, terrifying resolve. He slammed his fist on the table. Get me that signature, and I will set the type. I'll run an extra broadsheet that will burn this county to the ground. We'll paper this town with the truth. A tense, electric triumph filled the small, ink-stained room. They had a plan. They had the press. They had the law. And then, a bell began to clang. It was not a church bell. It was high, frantic, and panicked. The town firehouse. Rowan ran to the front window. A dull, orange glow was building in the darkness toward the rail yard. A man ran past in the street, shouting, "Fire, fire at the depot. The CC freight warehouse is burning." Ada Fenn's face went grim. Creed. He knows the ledger is gone. He's destroying the corroborating records. Mira ran to the door. Pulling it open, the smell of smoke, thick and oily, was already on the wind. The ticking clock hadn't just sped up, it had exploded. They weren't just racing to print the truth, they were racing to save it from the flames. The fire bell was a frantic, panicked scream, tearing the pre-dawn silence of Shade Bluff to shreds. The sound ripped Rowan and Mira from the tense quiet of the print shop. Rook's curse was a low, bitter prayer. "He's done it," the old printer whispered, his face ashen. "He's burning the evidence." They spilled out into the alley, the chaotic energy of a town in crisis slamming into them. The air was no longer cold and clean. It was thick with the oily, acrid smell of burning freight. A hellish orange-red glow pulsed from the rail yard, painting the undersides of the low-hanging clouds. People were shouting, running, half-dressed and terrified, toward the blaze. The CC freight warehouse was an inferno. Rowan saw the bucket line, and his trail boss instincts took over. It was a mess. Men were running into each other, shouting, disorganized, their efforts a pathetic splash against a sea of fire. No Rowan's voice cut through the din, a commander's roar that made men stop in their tracks. He seized a man by the shoulder, formed two lines, one from the well, one to the fire. Empty buckets go back on the left, full on the right. Move. He grabbed another. You get axes. We need a fire break, that lumber yard is next. The men, desperate for direction, obeyed. The panic began to coalesce into action. Rowan was in his element, a man carving order out of chaos. His hands and voice the tools. Mira watched him for a second. Then her own training took over. She saw a man stumble back from the line, his hands red and blistered. She saw another on his knees, coughing, his lungs full of smoke. This was her battle. She ran to the Gazette's front door, kicking it open. "Rook, I need cloth. Clean cloth and water, now." She dragged a small, sturdy table from the print shop and set it up on the boardwalk, a safe distance from the fire but close to the action. She commandeered a whiskey bottle from a passing saloon keeper. "For cleaning," she snapped, and he didn't dare argue. In moments, she had a first aid table, a small island of calm in the swirling panic. Ada Fenn was nowhere to be seen. She had not run toward the fire. She had not run toward the bucket line. Her eyes, sharp and focused, had scanned the panicked crowd and found what she was looking for: a single figure, a man in a CC uniform, moving away from the fire, hunched low, clutching a heavy steel cash box. He was slipping into the alley across the street, trying to use the chaos as his cover. Ada melted into the shadows, a ghost in the smoke, and followed him. A heavy wagon thundered into the square, its horses lathered and wild-eyed, scattering the crowd. Corporal Jonah Leving was at the reins, his face a grim mask. Beside him, String Calderon held a rifle, his fiddler's fingers now coiled around the trigger guard. Before the wagon had even skidded to a halt, a woman jumped from the back. She was not what Rowan expected. She was in her mid-40s, dressed in a plain gray traveling suit, her hair pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. She was unremarkable in every way, except for her eyes. They were the color of gray river rock, and they seemed to take in the entire, chaotic scene: the fire, Rowan's bucket line, Mira's aid station in a single, calculating sweep. This was Helen Morrissey. She radiated an authority that was absolute. She strode directly to Rowan. "You're Beckett." Her voice was crisp, cutting. Rowan nodded, wiping soot from his face. Ada Fenn appeared at his side, as if from nowhere. "He's the one, ma'am." "He and the woman, they're good." Morrissey looked at Rowan, then at Ada. "I am a U.S. Postal Inspector. This fire is an attempt to destroy evidence in a federal investigation." She reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 simple brass badges. She pressed one into Rowan's hand, the other into Ada's. "By the authority vested in me, I am deputizing you both. Your job is to protect this town and secure that evidence. Corporal Leving, your men will establish a perimeter. No one leaves. Understood?" "Yes," Ma'am Leving snapped, his voice ringing with the relief of having a lawful order. Rowan stared at the badge in his hand. The metal was heavy. It was real. The fire roared, a living, monstrous thing. It licked skyward, a column of orange and black that threatened to swallow the town. Embers, large as a man's fist, were raining down, and the wind was pushing the flames, not just toward the lumber yard, but toward the Gazette office. Rook Rowan roared, "Get those windows boarded." Mira, her face streaked with soot, was refilling a basin of water when she saw it. From the dark alley beside the print shop, a small, dark object was rolling. It was a keg, no bigger than a 5-gallon cask, and it was trailing a small, sputtering fuse. It rolled slowly, almost comically, over the uneven ground, coming to a stop directly beneath the front window of the Gazette, where Ephra Rook was frantically nailing a plank. It was a bomb, placed to destroy the press, the one thing that could tell the story. Rowan. Mira screamed, her voice tearing. The press. She didn't wait for him. She dropped the basin and ran. She was a nurse, a telegrapher, not a soldier, but she moved with a desperate, pure instinct. Her heavy, wet skirt dragged at her, but she didn't slow. She reached the small, sputtering keg. With 3 seconds left on the fuse, she didn't try to stop it. She kicked it, her boot connected with all her strength. The keg flew, tumbling end over end, back into the alley from which it had come. It detonated. A blinding, percussive whoomp erupted. It was not the shattering blast of dynamite, but the instantaneous, incinerating flash of powder. A brilliant, white-hot flower bloomed in the alley, so bright it bleached the world of color, followed by a shockwave that shattered every window on the block and sent Mira flying backward, skidding across the muddy street. She landed hard. The air knocked from her lungs. But she was alive. The press was safe. The explosion, the sudden, brilliant flash, drew every eye, and in that flickering, demonic light, Rowan looked up, high above them. On the flat roof of the burning warehouse, a figure stood silhouetted against the flames. It was Haggard Pike. He was not burning. He was not fleeing. He was calm, his heavy rifle shouldered, aiming not into the crowd, but with cold precision at the one person who represented the end of Creed's empire. He was aiming at Inspector Helen Morrissey. Inspector Down Mira shrieked from the ground, pointing. The rifle flashed. Rowan was closer. He didn't have time to think, to aim, to warn. He just moved. He launched himself sideways, his shoulders slamming into Helen Morrissey, his full weight hitting her like a linebacker. He knocked her clean off her feet, sending them both sprawling into the thick, cold mud of the street. The bullet, meant for her heart, found him instead. It was not a clean hit. It was a white-hot, searing pain. The lead tore a deep, fiery line across his upper chest, just under the collarbone. It ripped through his duster, his shirt, and his skin. A deep, glancing blow that felt like a red-hot poker being pressed against his bone. He cried out, a sharp, choked sound, his hand flying to the wound. He stumbled, but the solid, stubborn core of him refused to fall. While the square exploded in gunfire and screams, Ada Fenn moved through the silent, dark heart of the chandler's shop. The courier, a small, rat-faced man, was frantically stuffing papers into the shop's heating stove. "Federal agent," Ada's voice said. From 2 feet behind him, the man froze, the cold muzzle of her pistol pressed against the base of his skull. "Don't move. Don't even breathe." He stepped away from the stove, his hands raised high, on the table. The heavy steel cash box was open. Ada brought her lantern close. It was the mother lode, not cash, paper, bundles of postmarked letters, all returned, the forged foreclosure notices, a stack of sealed judge's orders, ready to be filed, and there, lying on a bed of velvet inside a small wooden box, was the linchpin of the entire conspiracy, a heavy, custom-made rubber signature stamp. It read, in perfect, flowing script, Ephraim Dodd. The chaos in the street had changed. The assassination attempt, the bomb, Rowan's public, bleeding sacrifice, it had broken the town's spell of fear. This was no longer a fire, it was an invasion. Aunt Rhea appeared, her face a mask of cold fury. She pushed through the bucket line, her medicine bag in hand. She saw Rowan, his hand pressed to his chest, his shirt already dark and wet. "You fool. Stubborn boy," she snapped, pushing his hand away. She pressed a thick, clean pad of linen against the bleeding crease. The wound was long and ugly, but the bullet hadn't lodged. "I told you to be careful. Now sit down before you bleed out." "I'm fine. Auntie?" Rowan grated, his face pale, but he stayed on his feet, refusing to show weakness. From the church, a new sound began. Reverend Whitlock, his face streaked with soot and tears of righteous rage, was ringing the town bell. But this was not the gentle ding-dong of Sunday service. This was a frantic, discordant clang, 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 the sound of war, the sound of alarm. It was a call to arms that every man and woman in the valley understood. The townsfolk who had been watching from their porches now surged forward. They grabbed axes from the woodpiles, shovels from the smithy. The bucket line doubled. The town, at last, was fighting back. Inside the Gazette, Helen Morrissey, her gray suit covered in mud, slapped the federal warrants down on Ephraim Rook's typesetting table. "You have your verification." "Mr. Rook," she said, her voice shaking with cold fury. That was all he needed. "Stringlock the galley," he roared. Rook's fear was gone, burned away by the fire and the bomb. He was a printer, and this was his weapon. Crowned Spade conspiracy rail supplier, judge in fraud, he and String, his hands black with ink, threw their combined weight against the massive iron lever of the press. With a groan and a satisfying clack-chunk, the machine came to life. The first sheets were feeding. The truth was becoming ink. On the warehouse roof, Haggard Pike saw it all. He saw his shot fail. He saw the town rise up. He saw the press, illuminated in the window, begin its work. He was beaten. He raised his rifle and fired one last, wild, defiant shot into the air. Then, as the burning roof began to sag, he turned and vanished, a dark shape swallowed by the pillar of oily black smoke. His voice, a furious, disembodied roar, echoed over the town. "This ain't done. You hear me? Beckett, you and that witch, that river will die by sundown tomorrow. I'll dynamite the headgate. You'll all be drinking dust." The threat hung in the smoky air, heavier than the fire. The warehouse collapsed in on itself in a final spectacular shower of sparks and flame. But the fire was contained. The lumber yard was saved. The Gazette was safe. Rowan leaned heavily against a water trough, the world tilting slightly. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain was a deep, throbbing sickness. He was pale, but steady. Aunt Rhea was finishing a tight, practical bandage that wrapped around his shoulder. Mira came to him, walking through the smoke. Her dress was torn, her face was a mask of soot, and her hands were raw. They looked at each other, two survivors on a battlefield. The night had cost them, had wounded them, but they were still standing. He reached out his good hand, his left. His fingers found hers, grasping them. His grip was tight, a transfer of his pain, his promise, his unbreakable resolve. She grasped back, her own small hand in pause, request timed out. The room above the print shop was small, smelling of paper dust, ink, and the lingering, acrid tang of smoke from the street below. It was a pocket of quiet carved from the heart of the chaos. Ephra Rook had called it his thinking room. Tonight, it was a field hospital and a war room. A single kerosene lamp, its wick turned low, cast a pool of soft, buttery light, leaving the corners in deep shadow. Rowan sat on a narrow cot, his back against the wall, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. The adrenaline that had held him upright for hours, that had allowed him to organize a bucket brigade and take a bullet, was gone. It had drained away, leaving him exposed, and the pain was rushing in to fill the void. It wasn't just the fiery, tearing protest of his shoulder. It was a deeper, colder ache. The fire, the shouting, the smell of smoke, the violence, it had all conspired to pull him back 2 years. He was in the dry culvert again. He could hear the thunder of 1,000 hooves, the high, thin scream of a panicked horse, the snap of bone. He could hear himself shouting Caleb's name, a raw, useless sound swallowed by the dust. The grief, which he had managed to pack down into a hard, dense stone of silence, had broken apart. It was flooding him, a sudden, bitter deluge. He closed his eyes, his breath hitching, his good hand clenched so tight his knuckles were white. Mira saw it. She saw past the grime and the blood. She recognized the tremor that had nothing to do with the wound. She had seen it 100 times in hospital wards, when a man's body was broken just enough for the deeper, older breaks in his spirit to show. She moved with the quiet, efficient grace of her old profession. She had a basin of warm water, steamed on Rook's small stove, and a fresh stack of linen strips Aunt Rhea had provided. She knelt in front of him, not asking permission, but simply beginning her work. "This will sting," she said, her voice low, almost a murmur. She dipped a cloth in the water. "But we have to clean it. The powder burns will fester." When the warm, wet cloth touched his skin, Rowan flinched, hissing a breath through his teeth. His whole body tensed, a rigid line of resistance. "Easy," she murmured. She didn't stop. She began to clean the long, ugly crease, her touch firm but incredibly gentle. As she worked, she started to count, her voice a soft, steady metronome in the quiet room. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was a nurse's trick, a simple, mindless rhythm to anchor a patient, to give their pain-drenched mind something to hold on to besides the hurt. 5, 6, 7. Rowan tried to focus on the numbers, but the grief was too strong. A single, hard tremor shook him. He should be here," he whispered, the words torn from him, raw and broken. "Caleb, he loved a good fight. I was the boss. I was supposed to keep him safe. Mira didn't offer platitudes. She didn't say, "It wasn't your fault," or "You have to be strong." She just kept counting, her voice a soft, unwavering presence, an acknowledgement that he was in pain and she was there with him. 11, 12, 13. She was cleaning away not just the soot and the blood, but the grime of his solitude. Her steady hands, her quiet counting, were an intimacy more profound than any caress. She was tending to the wound he could see, while tacitly acknowledging the one she couldn't. He opened his eyes and looked at her. Her face, illuminated from below by the lamp, was smudged with soot, her hair a wild tangle, her lips chapped, but her eyes were clear, steady, and full of a deep, weary understanding. He watched her hands, the bandaged wrists, as they moved with such gentle competence. The counting stopped. The wound was clean. She began to pack it with a thick, herbal salve from Aunt Rhea's bag. The silence that settled between them was different. It was not the empty, humming void of his ranch house. It was a shared quiet, a space that didn't need to be filled. "The loneliness," he said, his voice a rough rasp. "That's the worst of it. The kind that doesn't mind the noise, but can't stand the silence. It's too loud." He looked away, at the shadows in the corner. I haven't slept through a storm since the stampede. Any storm. The thunder. It sounds like the hooves. Mira finished her work. Tying the bandage with a neat, practiced knot, she sat back on her heels, her hands resting on her knees. I know what you mean, she said, her voice just as quiet. For me, it's not the storms, it's the quiet. Since Dry Step Station, since I've been running, I haven't slept without one boot on. She gave a small, mirthless huff of a laugh, sometimes both. I was always afraid I'd wake up and have to run, and I wouldn't have time to find my boots. Rowan looked at her, at this small, fierce, exhausted woman who had kicked a bomb and translated a conspiracy. A slow, tired smile touched his lips, a genuine warmth that reached his eyes. Leave the boots, he said, his voice soft. I'll keep watch. The words hung in the small, warm room. A promise so profound, it shifted the very air they were breathing. It was the most valuable thing one person could offer another in this world. Safety. Rest. I will be your shield while you sleep. Mira looked at him for a long, long moment. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the lines of pain around his eyes, the deep, aching sincerity. He was offering her the one thing she had forgotten how to accept. She made a choice. It was a slow, deliberate, and fully conscious decision. She was tired, so tired, of being afraid. She was tired of the cold, and the running, and the solitude. She wanted, just for a few hours, to be a person, not a fugitive, to be warm. She rose, not from her knees, but to her feet. She didn't move away. She stood over him, and he looked up at her. Then, she slowly, deliberately, sat on the narrow cot beside him. She did not lie down. She just sat, her shoulder a few inches from his good one. The space between them was electric, but it was not the hot, sharp crackle of desire. It was the low, steady hum of connection, of two solitudes recognizing each other. You need to rest. Rowan, she whispered, you've lost blood. So do you, he replied. He didn't move to touch her. He just waited. He had offered, and the choice was hers. He would not take, he would not presume. He honored the boundary, even as every part of him yearned for her closeness. She leaned, slowly, until her head rested on his good shoulder. Her hair, still smelling faintly of smoke and sage, brushed his cheek. He was solid, warm, and real. He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Just for a little while. She murmured into his shirt, just for a little while. He agreed. He carefully, cautiously, raised his good arm and wrapped it around her, pulling her closer to his side. It was not an embrace of passion, but of shelter. He was a wall against the night. She was a haven from his grief. She was cold. He was warm. Feverish from the wound. They shared the cot, two adults, fully consenting, finding a desperate, tender solace. He shifted, wincing, to lie back against the wall, and she curled into his side, her head on his chest, right over the steady beat of his heart. He felt her hand seek his, and their fingers interlaced, joined. Rowan, she whispered, her voice thick. I'm here, he said. She lifted her head, and he looked down at her. Her eyes were dark, searching. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was a kiss as slow and measured as a church bell on a quiet Sunday. It was not a kiss of hunger, but of affirmation. It was a kiss that tasted of soot and coffee and the salt of shed and unshed tears. It was a kiss that said, you are alive, I am alive, we are here. When they parted, there was no need for words. She laid her head back down on his chest. His good hand stroked her hair, a slow, comforting rhythm. Her clothes were still on, her boots were still on, but her eyes were closed. The lamplight fell on their joined hands. Rowan watched the flame, his own eyes growing heavy. The dread that had lived in his gut for 2 years, the cold, hard knot of it, began to unwind. It was replaced by a simple, profound warmth. The steady breathing of the woman in his arms, the solid weight of her against him. He was not alone. He slept. He slept through the shouting in the distant street, through the fading glow of the fire, through the first, cold approach of the morning. He slept, and for the first time in 2 years, he did not dream of the stampede. Dawn found them on the floor. Sometime in the night, they had moved, seeking more space. They were a tangle of limbs, propped against the wall. Rowan's head on her lap, her head leaning against his knee. They were fully dressed, still booted, and surrounded by paper. Mira woke first, her body stiff and aching, but her mind clear. The dread was gone. The night's intimacy had not been a distraction. It had been a sharpening, a steadying. It had forged their purpose. Rowan awoke, his shoulder a stiff, throbbing agony, but his mind was clear for the first time in years. The fog of his grief had lifted. He saw the maps scattered around them, the notes, the copy of the ledger. He saw Mira, her face soft in the gray light. Biscuits. He grunted, his voice a gravelly morning aftersound. She smiled, pointing to a tin plate Rook had left for them. And coffee. It's cold. They didn't waste time. They ate, sharing the hard biscuits, passing the cold tin cup of coffee between them. They were a team. Haggard Pike, Rowan said, his mouth full. He spread the map, his threat, the headgate. He'll do it. He will. Mira agreed, her mind already working. All nurse, all telegrapher, all strategist. He'll dynamite the main headgate on the Ash River. It will cut off the town, and every ranch downstream. He'll make good on his promise to make us drink dust. We have to ride. Stop him, Rowan said, already trying to push himself up. Wait. Mira put a hand on his good shoulder. Don't just react. Rowan, think. What's his real plan? He's not just trying to punish the town. He's trying to create a diversion. He needs chaos so Creed can escape, so Dodd can escape. He wants us all, every gun, riding to the headgate, so we give him what he wants. No, Mira said, her eyes flashing. We give him what he doesn't expect. We counter. She pulled the map closer. Look, here's the Ash River, and here's the headgate Pike will hit. But upstream, 2 miles north, is the Willow Narrows spillway. It's an old flood diversion. Aunt Rhea told me about it. It's been silted up for years. But the levers are still there. Rowan saw it. If we open the spillway, it does 2 things. Mira finished, her finger tapping the map. First, it temporarily starves the main channel. It will lessen the amount of water Pike can divert, making his sabotage less effective. But second, and more important, the spillway feeds the Old Town Canal, the one that runs right behind the courthouse. Rowan grinned, a wolfish, painful expression. It's been dry for 10 years. If that canal suddenly fills with water, it's proof. It's hard. Undeniable. Physical proof that the river is being tampered with, right in the center of town, for every rancher Aunt Rhea has gathered to see. It proves Pike's threat is real. It will be the final nail in Dodd's coffin. The door opened. Inspector Morrissey stepped in, followed by Ada, Leving, and Calderon. They looked as if they hadn't slept, but their eyes were bright with a hunter's energy. We have the courthouse surrounded, Morrissey said, wasting no time on greetings. Dodd is in there, holed up like a rat. The ranchers are arriving. Just as Mrs. Beckett planned. They're angry. What's your play? Beckett Rowan looked at Mira. Mira looked at Morrissey. The floodgates. Mira said. She laid out the plan, her voice clear, concise, and certain. Morrissey listened, her gray rock eyes unblinking. She didn't question it. She nodded once. It's a good plan. Tactical and symbolic. I like it. She became the field commander, assigning roles with swift precision. Ada, Calderon, you're with me. We're going to the courthouse. When that canal fills, we serve the warrants. We're taking Dodd, and we're taking the building. We'll hold it until this is done. Corporal Leving, she continued, you take Mrs. Beckett, marshal the ranchers she's gathered, ride to Willow Narrows. You are to open that spillway the second you hear a single shot fired from the head gate, not before. That's our signal. Leving nodded, his face set. And who stops? Pike Morrissey looked at Rowan and Mira. We do, Rowan said. He was already on his feet, his jaw tight against the pane. Pike is ours, Morrissey nodded. It's a pincer. He'll be caught between your guns and a river that won't obey him. Good. Go. The room cleared. A flurry of action. Rowan and Mira were alone again. For a final, brief moment, Rowan grabbed his duster. He winced, hissing as he tried to thread his wounded arm into the sleeve. It was impossible. He couldn't bend his shoulder. Wait, Mira said. She took the duster from him. She grabbed a knife from the table and, with 2 quick, decisive slashes, cut the right sleeve from the garment. You'll ride like this, she said, a makeshift sling. He slipped his good arm into the left sleeve, and she draped the heavy sleeveless duster over his wounded shoulder. She took a length of cloth and made a sling, knotting it tight. Her movements sure and practical. They were together. Still, a wounded warrior and his strategist, preparing for the last fight. He checked his Colt, his movements economical with his left hand. She checked her Spencer carbine. They were ready. As they walked to the door, Rowan paused. A small brass carriage lamp hung on a hook by the frame, unlit. He took a match from his pocket, struck it, and lit the wick. A small, clean flame sprang to life. He hung the lit lamp on the hook. It was a small ritual, an echo of the lamp at his ranch. But the meaning was enormous. It was the light they were carrying forward, a promise of their return, a beacon against the darkness they were riding to face. He looked at her. She nodded. Together. They stepped out of the safe room and into the cold, harsh light of the final day. The sky over Black Juniper Ridge was a bruised, churning purple, thunderheads, which had been gathering for hours, now piled on top of each other, their bellies heavy and dark, pressing the air down into the valley. The Ash River itself seemed to feel the oppression. It was no longer a placid, meandering line of blue, but a low, guttural growl, its surface choppy, its voice angry, as if it knew its own theft was at hand. At the headgate, the air was thick with the stench of axle grease and the ozone-sharp scent of the coming storm. The gate was a massive, timber and iron beast, a set of gears and winches that could choke the valley. Haggard Pike, his face flushed with exertion, stood on the platform, his hands on the large iron crank. Beside him, Silas Dern, his good arm aching, put his weight into the turn. With each turn, the massive gears groaned, their iron teeth biting into the wooden track. The sound was a shriek of protest, a slow-motion act of violence. Below them, the main canal that fed the downstream ranches was already shrinking. The wide flow of water faltered, shriveled, and became a muddy, sluggish trickle. The river was being stolen. Turn by turn. A third man, one of Creed's hired thugs, watched the banks, his rifle ready. Cole Dern, his arm in Mira's clean sling, stood apart, his face pale and conflicted, his own pistol still holstered. Put your back into it, Silas. Pike roared over the groan of the winch. Creed wants this valley dry by noon. He wants 'em begging. This ain't right. Haggard, Cole muttered, his first words of protest. Right is what Mr. Creed pays for Pike's spat. Not even looking at him. Now shut your mouth and grab a rifle, or I'll throw you in the sluice. He doesn't have to. The voice was not Pike's. It was calm, low, and full of a cold, clear authority. It came from the clearing. Haggard Pike spun, his hand dropping to his pistol. Silas let go of the crank, grabbing his rifle. Rowan Beckett stood at the edge of the willow thicket, 20 yards away. He was alone. His right arm was bound in a sling, his cut duster draped over his wounded shoulder. His face was pale, his jaw tight with pain, but his blue eyes were steady, and they burned with a light that was colder than the coming rain. Pike's surprise melted into a cruel, sneering grin. Well, looky here, the ghost of Half-Lantern. Come to watch your world die. Beckett. You're short an arm, and you're all alone. I'm not alone. Pike, Rowan said, his voice carrying easily in the heavy air. I'm here with my brother. Pike's grin faltered. Your brother's dust. You fool. He is... Rowan agreed, taking a slow step forward, his left hand, his good hand, open at his side. Caleb Beckett. Murdered. Run down in a culvert you dynamited to clear the way for Creed's line. You were there. I saw you. You and Silas. Silas Dern flinched, his eyes wide. I'm here with Ezra Miller, too, Rowan continued, his voice a steady, rhythmic condemnation. A litany of the dead, and his wife, burned out, and the 3 widows who sold their land to Creed for pennies after you cut their water last spring. Eliza Miller, Sarah Vaughn, Martha Coombs, you remember their names? Shut your mouth, Pike roared, his composure cracking. He raised his pistol, but he was hesitating, his eyes darting to the ridges. And I'm here with the living, Rowan said, his voice rising. A hammer blow. Aunt Rhea Beckett is on that ridge, Pike, and she's got a wagon load of ranch wives with her. Every woman you threatened, every family you starved out. They're sitting up there with affidavits. They're waiting for the signal. The whole county is watching you. While Rowan spoke, his words a weapon. Mira moved. She was a shadow among the deep green willow shades. Her Spencer carbine held low. She moved not toward the fight, but toward the supply wagon where Pike's men had stacked their tools, extra rifles, ammunition, and 3 heavy, 20-pound kegs of blasting powder, left over from the plan to dynamite the gate. She reached the wagon, her heart pounding a dull rhythm against her ribs. This was the threat. If Pike was cornered, he wouldn't just close the gate, he'd blow it, and the entire riverbank, to kingdom come. She had to neutralize the powder. She saw the fuses, coiled loosely on top of one of the kegs. She began to pull them, ripping the tarred cords from their holes. 1, 2, but as she reached for the 3rd, she saw it, a single, live fuse, already lit, sputtering on the wagon bed, a spark from Pike's cigar. A careless mistake, a ticking clock. It was burning down. With only seconds left, she had no time. She couldn't defuse it. She had to move it. She kicked the first 2 kegs, her boot connecting with the heavy wood. They rolled, thudding to the ground, and tumbled toward the deep, fast-moving sluiceway. But the 3rd one, the one with the live fuse, was heavy and awkward. She shoved it, and it rolled from the wagon, landing in the mud, its fuse hissing like a snake. Silas Dern saw the movement. The girl Pike. The girl is at the powder. He forgot Rowan, forgot the affidavits, and charged, his rifle raised, not to shoot, but to stop her. Rowan moved. He couldn't use his gun. He couldn't use his right arm. He just moved, a solid, wounded bull. He intercepted Silas, driving his left shoulder, his good shoulder, straight into the man's chest. The impact was brutal, a crack of bone, a grunt of expelled air. The momentum sent both men tumbling down the steep, muddy bank, crashing into the shallows of the river. Mira didn't look back. She ran, her hat flying from her head, her dark hair streaming. She ran for the hissing keg. Haggard Pike saw it all. He saw Rowan and Silas in the water. He saw Mira, exposed, dashing for the bomb. He raised his rifle, a clean, perfect shot. Haggard, no Cole Dern. His face a mask of agony and decision. Finally made his choice. He remembered the clean bandages. You'll be useless. He remembered Mira's mercy. He yanked his own pistol from its holster and raised it. Not at Haggard, but at the sky. Stand down, he yelled. It's over. Don't you, Pike, didn't even turn. With a backhand motion of pure, vicious rage, he swung his heavy rifle, the steel-plated butt of it crashing into the side of Cole's head. The sound was a sickening, wet crack. Cole crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even hit the mud. Haggard spun, leveled his rifle, and fired at Mira. The shot screamed past her ear. So close she felt the heat of it. She threw herself sideways, a desperate, sliding dive. Just as the bullet tore a gout of mud from where she had been, she landed hard, her shoulders slamming the ground. She looked up. The keg was 2 feet away, its fuse spitting, a half-inch from the powder hole. It was teetering on the wooden edge of the sluice, and as she watched, a splash of water from Rowan's fight in the river arced up, landing on the fuse. With a final, angry psst, the spark died. The fuse was out. The bomb was dead. At that exact second, a single rifle shot echoed from the high ridge. Crack! A clean, sharp report. Rowan, climbing out of the river, his hand clamped on Silas's collar, looked up. A second shot answered the first. Crack! Ada's signal, and from Shade Bluff, miles down the valley, the town bell, which had been silent, began to ring. It was not the frantic clang of the fire. It was a deep, joyous, steady peal. Bong, 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 the sound of victory. Ada's team had judged Dodd. The courthouse was theirs, as if summoned by the bells. The bluffs above the headgate came alive, a line of riders, silhouetted against the dark, churning sky, crested the ridge. At the front was Aunt Rhea, sitting her big mare like a general, a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. Beside her, Corporal Jonah Leving, his blue uniform a stark slash of color, his face set, and behind them, not a mob, but a company wagon loads of grim-faced ranchers and their wives, the very people Rowan had named, the living witnesses to Creed's crimes. Haggard Pike stared, his rifle useless in his hands. He was caught. In the name of the United States Postal Service and the territory of Wyoming, Corporal Leving's voice boomed, amplified by the valley walls. Lay down your arms. Pike's remaining thug raised his rifle, a last, defiant act. He never fired. From the line of riders, lassos, not bullets, snaked through the air. They were the tools of ranchers, not killers. The ropes whipped out with expert precision. One loop settled over the thug's rifle, yanking it from his grasp. Another settled over Pike's shoulders, pinning his arms to his sides. It was not a lynching. It was the law, clean and final. The ranchers held the ropes, their faces hard, but they did not pull. They waited. The clatter of a fast-moving carriage cut through the sudden quiet. A varnished buckboard, pulled by 2 magnificent, high-stepping bays, charged into the clearing. Barlow Creed was at the reins, his silk tie flapping in the wind. He was not afraid. He was furious. He pulled the horses to a rearing stop, his eyes taking in the scene his men bound. The ranchers on the ridge, the soldiers. He fixed his gaze on Morrissey, who had just ridden up with Leving. He tried to bluff, his voice smooth, full of charismatic outrage. Inspector Morrissey. What is the meaning of this outrage? This is private property. My men are securing my equipment. This is business. You are interfering with the progress of this entire territory. He was reaching inside his fine wool coat, his fingers searching, his smile never wavering. It's not business. Mr. Creed. Mira stepped out from the shadow of the sluiceway. She was covered in mud, her hair a wild tangle, her dress torn. She leveled the Spencer carbine at his chest, its theft, and its murder, in her other hand. She held up the leather-bound ledger. I have your book. I have your ciphers. Inspector Morrissey rode her horse forward, positioning herself between Creed and Mira. She held up the federal warrant, the red wax of the crowned spade seal gleaming in the flat. Stormy light, Barlow Creed. She read, her voice ringing. I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and incitement to murder. The mask of civility shattered. Creed's face, for a single, naked moment, was a mask of pure, cornered animal rage. He saw it was over. He saw the ledger. He saw the warrant. He lunged. He didn't lunge for a weapon. He lunged for the paper. He launched himself from the buckboard, his hands clawing, trying to grab the warrant from Morrissey's hand, to destroy the one, final, legal document. Rowan was closer. He was still in pain, his arm useless, his body aching. He didn't have time to draw his pistol. He just reacted. He stepped directly into Creed's path. He was a wall. He didn't strike. He simply stood, and Creed, in his blind, desperate lunge, smashed into Rowan's solid, immovable form. The impact was jarring, knocking Creed completely off balance. He spun, his elegant coat flying, and slammed hard into the tall wooden tailgate of his own buckboard. The thud of the impact was final. Before Creed could even draw a breath, before he could recover, Corporal Leving and Ada Fenn were on him. Ada twisted his arm behind his back, and Leving snapped the handcuffs on his wrists. The sharp, metallic click-click of the cuffs locking shut was the loudest sound in the valley. A new sound began, a deep, distant roar, coming from upstream. Leving looked at the ridge, and a single, answering shot cracked from his ranks. The signal, at Willow Narrows. His men had thrown the levers, miles away, in Shade Bluff. The ranchers gathered in the courthouse square let out a collective gasp. A surge of brown, foaming, angry water, a foot high, burst into the dry, 10-year-old town canal. It surged past the courthouse, past the jail, a living, liquid testament to the river's manipulation, a final, undeniable witness for every eye to see. The river was fighting back, and as if the river's release had finally broken the sky's tension, the rain began, the thunderheads opened, and the first, cold, heavy drops began to fall. It was not a violent storm, but a steady, cleansing, unscripted rain. It fell on the bound men, on the victorious ranchers, on the filled canal. It washed the soot from Mira's face and the blood from Rowan's wound. The river and the land were taking back their names. The rain that had broken the sky over the headgate was a soft, cleansing silver by the time it reached Shade Bluff. It fell on a town transformed. The oppressive, fearful silence that had defined life under Creed's shadow was gone, replaced by a low, buzzing hum of disbelief, relief, and a dawning, fierce joy. Ephra Rook's press had run all morning, its rhythmic, thundering clack-chunk, a new heartbeat for the town. Now, his broadside sheets, still damp, the black ink smelling sharp and righteous, were slapped onto every available surface. They clung to the walls of the general store, the livery, the courthouse doors, their headlines stark and undeniable under the gray sky. Crowned Spade Conspiracy Rail Supplier, Judge in Fraud. Below, the names were printed in stark, damning type Barlow Creed, Judge Ephraim Dodd, Haggard Pike, Silas Dern, and, in a smaller, separate line that spoke of a different kind of Justice Cole Dern, testifying for the territory, on the steps of the small clapboard church, where Reverend Whitlock had so often preached timid sermons of forbearance. A new congregation had gathered. It was a crowd of women, mostly, the ranch wives Rowan had named, their faces etched with years of hardship and worry, their hands calloused from work they'd had to do alone. They were the widows, the dispossessed, the survivors. Aunt Rhea stood on the top step, a broadside held in her steady hands, her voice clear and strong as she read the words aloud. She read the account of the fraud, the theft of the water, the murder of Caleb Beckett, with every sentence, a collective sigh, a murmur of vindication, a sob of long-held grief, rippled through the crowd. When she finished, a ragged, tearful cheer went up, a sound that was less about triumph and more about the simple, profound relief of being heard, of being believed. Reverend Whitlock stood beside her, his face streaked with rain and tears of his own. The fire had burned the cowardice out of him. He raised his hands, not in a gesture of meek supplication, but of strength. He finally found the bravery to pray a prayer of gratitude, not of fear, his voice booming with a newfound conviction that made the women weep all the harder. From the edge of the square, a new sound began to weave through the rain-soaked air. String Calderon sat on an overturned barrel, his fiddle tucked under his chin. He wasn't playing a wild, foot-stomping reel. He was playing a slow, sweet, and achingly beautiful air. a melody that spoke of loss and endurance and the quiet, stubborn hope of a new morning. And as the music swelled, a small miracle happened. A group of children, who had been hiding in doorways, their faces pinched with the fear they had absorbed from their parents, began to emerge, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. They began to spin in the square, their arms outstretched, their faces turned up to the clean, gray rain. There was no peril in their play, no threat lurking in the shadows. It was a dance of pure, unadulterated joy. The town, for the first time in years, was breathing like a chest unbound. Near the marshal's office, Inspector Helen Morrissey stood with Rowan. His arm was in a clean sling, the wound on his chest tightly bound. He was pale and moved stiffly, but he stood tall. "You did good work, Mr. Beckett," Morrissey said, her voice devoid of sentiment but full of a deep, professional respect. She extended a hand, and Rowan shook it with his good one. "The territory owes you a debt. We all paid it," Rowan said, his gaze moving to Mira, who stood nearby with Ada Fenn. Their heads bent together over the ledger one last time. Morrissey followed his gaze. "Your partner is a remarkable woman. She has a mind like a steel trap and the courage of a soldier. A woman like that is wasted mending socks." She walked over to Mira. "Miss Solace, when this is settled, the U.S. Postal Service will have need of a special civilian cipherist attached to my office. The work is difficult, the hours are long, and the pay is poor." Ada Fenn grinned, a rare flash of humor on her serious face. "The pay's poor," she chimed in, "but the purpose is rich." Mira looked from Ada's grin to Morrissey's steady, gray rock eyes. A slow smile spread across her own face, a smile of genuine, unburdened happiness. "Inspector," she said, "I accept." A commotion at the edge of the square drew their attention. A prison wagon was being loaded. Barlow Creed, his fine suit spattered with mud, was led into the cage, his face a mask of disbelief and sputtering rage. Judge Dodd, without his robes, looked small and withered, a common criminal. Then came Haggard Pike. He was shackled, but unbowed. As two of Leving's soldiers shoved him toward the wagon, he stopped, his malevolent gaze sweeping the square. He saw Rowan. He saw Mira, and his face contorted. He didn't curse them. He turned his fury on the land itself. "You think you've won," he roared, his voice a gravelly snarl. He pointed a shackled hand toward the river, which was now running full and clean through the valley. "That river betrayed us. It'll betray you, too. It'll flood. It'll dry up. You can't tame this country." He was still cursing the river as the wagon door slammed shut, his voice a final, impotent howl of rage. The river, flowing steady and true, did not answer. Night settled over the half-lantern ranch, a deep, velvet quiet that was profoundly different from the humming, empty silence of Rowan's long solitude. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean, the sky littered with a billion sharp, diamond-bright stars. Inside, the small house was warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. A pot of Aunt Ria's stew simmered on the stove, and the green glass lamp, which Rowan had carefully removed from its nail and brought home, sat in the center of the kitchen table, its honeyed light pushing the shadows into the corners. He moved to the kitchen window, the one that looked out over the endless, dark prairie. He had a new hook, a new nail. He hung the lamp in the window, where its light could be seen for miles. It was no longer a signal against the night. It was a welcome. He turned. Mira stood in the doorway to Caleb's old room, which was now her room. She had washed, her face clean of soot, her dark hair brushed and tucked into a simple ribbon at the nape of her neck. She wore a soft, borrowed dress of Aunt Ria's, a deep blue that matched the twilight outside. She stepped into his arms. He held her, his good arm wrapping around her back, his hand spreading wide and warm at the small of her back. She leaned into him, her head resting on his chest, right below the thick bandage. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart. It was a quiet, heartbeat still seen. They were not two lovers swept up in passion. They were two weary soldiers who had survived the war. Finally finding their harbor, they were undressing the day's worries. Not each other. She reached up, her fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the rough stubble, the weariness in the tense muscle. He bent his head, his lips finding not her mouth, but the soft, vulnerable pulse at her throat. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a gesture of gratitude and reverence for the life that beat there. His palm at her back was a silent promise of safety, of stability. She took his hand, her fingers lacing with his, and led him toward her room. The door eased shut, the soft click of the latch, the only sound. The rest of the night was theirs, a quiet, private space, all tastefully off-screen. Later, they lay awake in the narrow bed, the pale starlight from the window tracing patterns on the floor. The space was small, their bodies close, a shared warmth under the thick wool blankets. They were not sleeping. They were talking, trading stories in the deep, quiet hush of the night. Hers were of the hushed, lamp-lit wards of the Cheyenne Hospital, of holding the hands of dying men, of the sharp, rhythmic chatter of the telegraph key, a language of wires and whispers that had taught her how to listen to the world's secrets. His were of the immense, star-dusted cattle skies, of the camaraderie of men on long drives, of the smell of dust and leather, and of the profound, aching loss that had hollowed him out, a loss he could finally speak of without its ragged edges tearing him apart. Laughter came, soft and easy in the darkness. It was a healing sound, a thread of gold that stitched together the parts of them that grief and fear had torn. Sometime near dawn, the lamp in the other room began to gutter, its oil running low. Mira slipped from the bed, her movements quiet. She went to the table and lifted the delicate glass chimney to trim the wick. Rowan watched her, a silhouette in the warm, fading light. She finished, her task done, and turned back toward the room. She paused in the doorway, looking at him, a soft, steady smile on her face. She whispered the words again, the same words she had spoken on that first, desperate night, but they were different now. The tremor was gone, the fear was gone. They were no longer a plea, or a joke, or a threat. They were a promise, a new oath. You're not sleeping alone anymore. He reached out his hand from the bed. She came and took it, and with his other hand, he reached over to the bedside table, and with a simple pinch of his thumb and forefinger, he snuffed the flame of the small candle he had lit. The darkness that filled the room was not an absence. It was a presence. It was the warm, breathing, shared dark of belonging. At dawn, 2 riders left the half-lantern. They were not alone. Inspector Morrissey and Ada Fenn, their faces set with a familiar, grim purpose, rode with them. They were headed north, toward Silver Lark Basin, where rumors, brought by one of Aunt Ria's ranch wives, said that another crowned spade cell was damming a creek. Their methods brutal, their reach long. Rowan and Mira rode side by side, their shoulders almost touching. The fight was not over. The West was still a hard, dangerous place, but they were no longer fighting alone. They were a team, and back at the ranch, in the kitchen window, the green glass lamp waited for their return. Home lit, hearts lit, a West, at last, unafraid. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from. So please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories. 1850, give this video a like, and support us further by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.